Magna Story Sound presents an unabridged recording of The Narrowboat Girls, written by Rosie Archer, read by Charlotte Strevens. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Magna, Gargrave, BD23 3SE. CD 1. Chapter 1. Gosport, 1944. I couldn't help it. Now she's having my baby, what can I do? You could have kept it in your trousers. Elsie Barker turned away from her husband of 10 years. She wasn't going to allow him to see her fall to pieces. No matter what she felt on the inside, outside, she would show him she could handle things. Who is the woman who's carrying your child? She was finding it difficult to keep calm. Just someone from my office. Unanswered questions began hurling themselves around her brain. Does this just someone have a name? He coughed. Sandra. But it's not her fault that... For someone usually so articulate, her husband was having difficulty in answering. Sandra. Even the name sounded more glamorous than her own, thought Elsie. Then came his second blow. I'm happier now than I've ever been, so I'm putting the house on the market. There should be enough money for you to buy somewhere in Gosport. He screwed on the lid of the homemade marmalade, and the scent of the oranges faded as he calmly picked up the newspaper. Fleetingly, she remembered cutting the rind into chunky pieces, just the way Geoffrey liked, and marvelled that he could even think about reading and eating after telling her she should be the one to leave their home. Why can't I stay here? My severance pay from teaching helped buy the house. Tears were pricking at the back of her eyes. How could he do this awful thing to her? She thought suddenly of the early days, the fun they'd had searching antique shops for just the right pieces of furniture to fit into the 5-bedroomed Western Way house in Ulverstoke. This was her dream home, backing onto Stanley Park, a house with a considerable garden on which she lavished care and attention. Geoffrey put down the paper and adjusted his cuffs beneath the sleeves of his dark pinstriped jacket. At 40 years of age, he liked his highly polished shoes to complement the colour of his suits and ties, to add just that little something extra to inspire confidence in his clients. He eyed her speculatively. This house is too big for one person. When I bought it, we were going to fill it with children. But don't you dare make it out to be my fault. Our doctor says infertility can happen to couples who want children too much. Elsie longed to hold a baby of her own in her arms. She blinked back the tears. It's no one's fault, Geoffrey said quietly, with surprising gentleness. But you must surely understand why I need to buy another house, and I can't afford it until this one is sold. His eyes met hers. You'll be happier in a small place of your own. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Elsie found she was staring at him as though she'd never seen him before in her life. So many questions needed answers, but every reply might split her heart into pieces. Then, despite everything, she could see his logic. The house, after all, belonged to him. Geoffrey Barker, of Barker and Noel, solicitors of the High Street, Gosport in Hampshire. He was nothing if not logical, and his quick brain was what made the partnership so successful. Even the terrible war years had been profitable for the firm. Will you leave me now? Elsie asked. I need to think about this carefully. She looked past him to the conservatory, where the honeysuckle she had lovingly planted a couple of years ago was beginning to climb the glass to give shade during the hot days of summer. Geoffrey folded his newspaper methodically. He was a very tidy man. For a while he simply stared at her, then asked, as he laid the newspaper by the side of his plate, Will you be all right? I'll be as all right as any woman whose husband tells her over the breakfast toast and marmalade that he's fallen in love with a tart from his office. Her anger was rising again. Stop it, Elsie. Sarcasm doesn't become you. And suddenly, She could hold herself back no longer. "Go!" she yelled, leaping up and shaking her fist. "Get out! Get away from me!" He beat a hasty retreat from the kitchen. Presently, she heard the front door slam and his car start up. Then there was the crunch of tyres on the gravel in the driveway, and he was gone. Of course she hadn't wanted him to leave. What her heart desired was for him to take her into his arms, beg her forgiveness, and say they would get through this together. Tell her there was no Sandra from his office, no baby, and that he would always love her. But that was as impossible as him suddenly swinging her around in his arms, high off the floor, and telling her he adored her. The spontaneous part of their marriage, despite her own efforts, had died long ago. Elsie sat down at the kitchen table, put her head in her hands, and gave way to her grief. Her marriage was over. Her home was shortly to be sold. Her life was in pieces. She wanted to curl up in bed and die. But in less than an hour, she'd be standing on the line in Priddy's hard munitions factory where she worked part-time, filling shells with gunpowder, helping the war effort in the fight against Adolf Hitler. Tonight, after work, she was to attend a farewell get-together. Her friend Izzy was off to do another job left vacant by a man who'd gone to fight. Elsie couldn't possibly put her own feelings first and not meet Izzy at the Fox public house in Gosport Town. Could she put on a brave face and pretend everything was fine with her, Geoffrey and their marriage, so Izzy wouldn't have to worry about her? She realised she'd been a fool for never questioning Geoffrey's tales of working late. She'd tolerated his stories of weekend conferences at Brighton, Worthing, and other seaside places. There had been quite a few these past months. Excuses for meetings with Sandra. Had she been too occupied with the house, her job, the garden, to wonder about Geoffrey's frequent disappearances? It had honestly never entered her mind that Geoffrey was straying further and further away from her. She had accepted her marriage for what it was, and she had trusted him. Elsie picked up the teapot to pour herself more tea, and saw that she hadn't touched the first cup, but allowed it to go cold. She stared at the beautiful blue creation in her hand. She and Geoffrey had discovered it in an antique shop in Winchester on a wonderful summer's day, just before the war had started. "Damn you!" Elsie cried, and flung it towards the wall. The pot smashed. Brown tea streamed down the pale wallpaper in rivulets, then dripped onto the cream rug. For a moment she felt triumphant, then distressed. Her outburst had changed nothing. She could dig in her heels and refuse to budge from her home, but what good would that do? Her mother had told her many years ago, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. She'd been a wise woman. Did she really want to hang on to a man who had so callously cast her aside? Elsie would take the new home offered her. Better to do that than pursue a long drawn-out fight over property that she couldn't win. Geoffrey's name was on the deeds, and his profession meant he would already have covered all aspects of a possible divorce, including any maintenance claims she might make. Geoffrey's job didn't stop him enlisting, but he'd had rheumatic fever as a child, and it had left him with a heart murmur. There was no way fate, in the form of call-up papers, would intervene and leave her in the house she loved. She would not dwell on her husband sleeping with another woman. Why waste mental anguish on something she couldn't change? She stared across the table at herself in the mirror. She was 30 years old, still slim, and by no means stupid. Then it hit her like a ton of bricks. Losing her husband wasn't as painful as thinking about him impregnating another woman. That hurt, like a knife twisting in an open wound. It might be wise to remove herself from Gosport. The thought of bumping into pregnant Sandra on Geoffrey's arm in the small town was too much for her to think about. She would get ready for work. The chatter of the factory girls on the line was enough to brighten anyone's day. She would decide where she could go to get on with her life while her affairs were put in order. That would pose a problem. How long would it take Geoffrey to find a house buyer? Where could she go to lick her wounds until she was ready to buy a place of her own? Elsie had no relatives. Her mother had died earlier in the war. She had very little money of her own. Could she rely on Geoffrey to fund her? Probably not, if he needed to sell the house. His excuse would be that his new family must come first. Automatically, Elsie began to clear up the mess she'd made. When she'd swept up the broken china and tea leaves, she took the dustpan outside, then slid the pieces of her beloved teapot into the dustbin, with the rest of her broken dreams. Chapter 2. Elsie propped her bicycle beneath the shelter among the long line of other bikes. With petrol rationed, most of the staff cycled to work. She liked riding along leafy Green Lane, down Whitworth Road, then Weevil Lane to the munitions factory, even though due to the incessant bombing, Gosport's roads frequently changed shape and were sometimes difficult to negotiate. Heaps of rubble that had once been homes and shops were piled like gapped teeth. The stink of dust and cordite seemed ever present. Izzy caught up with her at the main gate to Priddy's. "You are coming tonight, aren't you?" Isabel Baker, whom everyone called Izzy, looked worried. She reminded Elsie of a mischievous pixie, with her cloud of red hair framing a heart-shaped face. Her black eye, courtesy of her boyfriend, had changed colour today, and the thick panstick foundation almost, but not quite, disguised it. "Wouldn't miss it," said Elsie. She really liked the 19-year-old girl who was quick and nimble-fingered at her job, always ready with a smart retort. Already the pair had begun shrugging off their coats, ready to hang up when they entered the locker room. All the women starting their shifts would remove their everyday clothes and put on the navy blue dungarees and turbans in different colours, depending on the area in which they worked. They would be searched for contraband. Hair grips, jewellery, cigarettes and matches. Anything that could cause a spark was a fire hazard. Safety at all times was paramount. Elsie asked, "Is your Charlie coming back late tonight or tomorrow?" She saw the flash of fear in Izzy's eyes before the girl whispered, so that only she might hear. "He's due back tomorrow afternoon from his business in Southampton. By then, I hope to be arriving in the countryside. Mum won't say a dicky bird. She's been telling me for ages to get away from Charlie Osborne." "You keep it that way. That brute doesn't deserve a nice girl like you. And rest assured, when I get hold of an address to write to you, Charlie won't worm it out of me." Elsie was aware that Charlie was obsessed with Izzy and needed to know where she was at all times, but his jealousy caused him to be cruel. Convinced he couldn't trust her, he frequently lashed out at her. Gunpowder in cuts and grazes stung like hell. In Elsie's locker in the changing room, she kept a small brown bottle of iodine to dab on Izzy's skin when Izzy refused to see the nurse at Priddy's. The temper that Charlie couldn't control was what Izzy's mum called being highly strung. One day he would be happy, almost overexcitable, and the next so down in the dumps that once Izzy had caught him crying over a newspaper account of the discovery of Hitler's concentration camps. Not that the atrocities weren't horrendous, they were. But on another day, Charlie could read the same story and gloss over it as though it was simply part and parcel of war. Charlie was generous, but Izzy told Elsie that he seemed to imagine he owned her. He had been married when he was younger, he was now 30, but his wife had left him, and he'd taken a long time to get over the shock and the shame. Izzy thought Charlie was terrified the same thing might happen again, so he hardly let her out of his sight. It wasn't as if she could look forward to the possibility of Charlie being called up, because forged medical papers meant he would never fight for his country. Charlie dabbled in the black market, courtesy of the American stores at Southampton, lent money at exorbitant interest rates, and often went to extraordinary lengths to make sure the money was repaid. At present, he was working on a project, he'd told Izzy, that would make him exceedingly rich. A small band of his faithful satellites shone about their star leader. Izzy had been flattered when the curly-haired, good-looking young man had asked her to dance with him at the Connaught Hall. She'd been 16, naive, and now rued that fateful night.
If the only way I can get out of his clutches is to leave Gosport, I have to take this job. I'm frightened of making a new start, but more scared that one day Charlie might do me some proper damage, she added.
Weeks previously, Izzy had gone for the job interview. She hadn't said a word to anyone at the factory except Elsie. She'd asked for the day off, telling her line manager a fib about a hospital appointment. Charlie had been waiting as usual outside the main gate when her shift had ended. Izzy had run from Hutfield's coach station in Fortin Road to arrive at the munitions factory only minutes before Charlie had arrived to collect her. Elsie knew Izzy hated deceiving anyone, but with Charlie it was sometimes a necessity to stretch the truth a little. "I heard of a woman once whose husband was like Charlie," Elsie said. Sometimes Geoffrey offered her morsels from his cases. She was too frightened to tell the hospital what was happening to her when she had to return, time and time again with injuries. Kept saying she was walking into doors and falling downstairs. She was too scared not to keep taking him back every time he walked out on her and the kids after he'd given her a beating. Each time he told her things would change. As her friend tucked her hair beneath her turban, Elsie saw the blue marks of new bruising around her wrists and knew she'd touched a nerve.
Was it ever different for her?
Elsie shook her head. She watched Izzy pull on the special boots they all had to wear. She wouldn't tell her that the woman had died by her own hand. She'd had every shred of her confidence knocked out of her, and sooner than strike out on her own, away from her awful husband, she'd ended it all with a rope in the shed. Her 2 little girls were being cared for in a children's home. Izzy didn't need to be aware of that either, thought Elsie. Not when she had the chance and the courage to run from her own abusive relationship. Inside Priddy's, the air smelt of sulphur, saltpetre and charcoal. Gunpowder clung to every surface, and Elsie hated it. The dust turned skin yellow, and although the turbans protected the women's hair, fringes that hadn't been tucked in properly went orange. The cordite was also responsible for most of the respiratory difficulties to which the women succumbed. Itchy skin and kidney problems featured a great deal in the workers' lives. Though the women and men were aware of the health risks, they felt they were serving their country. Yesterday, Elsie had heard on the wireless that the Allies had taken back Florence in Italy from the Germans. But the newsreader had also spoken of the dreadful V1s that had fallen on London and along what was known as Buzz Bomb Alley, a strip of England running across the south coast. Adolf Hitler was concentrating the showers of bombs on where he knew airfields, factories, munition yards and shipbuilders abounded. Children were being evacuated again. 100 to 150 V1s were aimed daily towards the area and had caused so far almost 3,000 deaths and serious injuries. Elsie tucked her arm through Izzy's. Working together and sharing secrets had made the two firm friends, despite the difference in their ages. Today, Elsie was determined she wouldn't spoil Izzy's pleasure in her new job by telling her about Geoffrey's infidelity. Izzy mustn't be allowed to leave Gosport worrying about her. "Come here," said Elsie. She swung Izzy round to face her and poked into the turban the ginger curls that had already strayed out. "Red hair goes green. You've got to remember that." Izzy laughed. After being searched and checked by Petunia Yates, the overseer, the two women crossed the stone floor and walked down to their workroom. Their rubber-soled boots were silent as they moved. Leather soles were forbidden, as were the metal toe and heel clips called Blakey's that prolonged shoes wear, but caused sparks. "Just you think yourself lucky the wedding never happened." Elsie stared at Izzy. "You'd find it more difficult to get away from him if you were married."
"Some angel must have been looking after me when Charlie got into a fight on his stag night and ended up in hospital."
Elsie squeezed Izzy's arm. "I know you were too scared to tell him you didn't want to get married."
"He'd spent a fortune on the reception."
Izzy tried to make light of the wedding that hadn't happened at Fareham Register Office.
And he's never let you forget it.
Elsie knew Charlie was angry with himself for messing things up and took it out on Izzy.
Thank goodness you never went to live with him, she added.
Izzy still lived with her mum in Albert Street. Of course, Charlie wasn't happy about that, but Izzy could hardly cohabit without the advantage of a wedding ring, so for the sake of propriety, Charlie had had to abide by her decision. Gossip mongers were rife in Gosport. Elsie remembered when Izzy had broken off their engagement and thrown the ring at him. Charlie had scared her mother half to death by hammering on their front door in an effort to get Izzy to speak to him. After the door knocker had broken and Charlie had shattered the front room window, Izzy had given in and opened up to see him, tears streaming from his eyes. Apologising, he was soon on his knees in front of all the neighbours. To save further embarrassment, Izzy had taken back the ring that Charlie had searched for and found in the gutter. Everything had gone well for a while, until Charlie had taken her to a dance at Bury Hall in Gosport, and a sailor on leave had spoken to her. Horror of horrors, she'd answered him. Izzy had said then,
"The only way I can escape from Charlie's clutches is to leave Gosport and pray he doesn't find me."
Now she confided to Elsie,
"These few days have been so nice without Charlie driving me to and from work. It's been lovely being on my own."
"You've got it all to come again after tomorrow, don't forget," Elsie said, patting Izzy's arm. Izzy gripped Elsie's hand.
"Charlie's due back from Southampton around 4. Promise me, no matter how much he goes on, you won't tell him anything. He's bound to be waiting outside the gates, and when I don't turn up, he'll make a beeline for you."
Elsie tried to make light of her friend's fears. "It won't be a smack from your fella you'll get, but one from me if you ever think I'd tell anyone." The two women had reached the long workroom where the huge machines and conveyor belts sent along the shell cases to be filled. On the line, concentration on the job was of the utmost importance. Whatever Elsie was feeling about Geoffrey's ultimatum, she dared not allow it to interfere with her work. Lives depended on steady hands. Already the wireless was playing the music that helped to keep the girls' spirits up. Vera Lynn, with her patriotic songs, to which they all sang along, and the latest heartthrob, Frank Sinatra, the skinny Italian boy with the wonderful voice. The munitions factory, hidden in woodland but set on the banks of Fortin Creek, had easy access for ships to carry the shells across the harbour. It had its own railway line that connected to another munitions factory on the outskirts of Fareham. Wages were high, but Elsie spent most of what she earned on the garden and the house.
"I'll be getting bed and board,"
Izzy began, then became quiet as two chatting workers passed them.
"The pay isn't good, but I can't see what I'd need to spend it on."
Elsie nodded. "You're so much more relaxed when Charlie's not about," she said. She didn't want to think of her own unhappiness.
"He's doing a deal on drink and cigarettes at the American base. Those black market schemes are extremely profitable for him,"
confessed Izzy. "Won't you miss some of the perks? Stockings, perfume, makeup?" Elsie asked. Charlie liked to shower Izzy with little gifts. The war had been going on for such a long time that the Americans were the only people with decent food.
"I don't care about that. Having my freedom is much more important."
"Shh." More women were filing into the workshop. Elsie didn't want anyone to overhear the two of them talking. Izzy had never told her exactly where she was going, so Charlie wouldn't be able to force her destination from her. Elsie rubbed her eyes. "You're doing the right thing, you know." She smiled at Izzy. If only she knew what her own next step would be. Chapter 3. At 7 o'clock, Elsie pushed open the side door to the Fox in North Cross Street and was engulfed by a cloud of cigarette smoke. Wearing her second-best grey two-piece suit and a cream blouse, a sober outfit befitting a solicitor's wife, she stared shyly around the noisy bar. Izzy jumped up from the worn velvet bench in the corner and came to meet her with a broad smile.
"I've saved you a seat,"
she said excitedly, pulling her inside.
"Want a gin and orange?"
Sam, the landlord, heard Izzy call to him and began pouring gin into the measure, then tipping it into glasses. Elsie made herself comfortable next to Izzy, and when genial Sam brought over the drinks, the red-haired girl waved money at him and told him to take a drink for himself. The wireless was blaring big band music. The once white paint in the bar was yellowed by nicotine, but the pub was a haven for locals. Elsie soon forgot she'd stood outside for a long time, plucking up the courage to enter, because she wasn't used to going inside licensed premises without Geoffrey. Before the war, only women of ill repute had gone into pubs alone, but now so many women were in the workplace doing men's jobs, and the young had grown brave. Elsie took a sip of her drink, then stared about her, nodding at a couple of old men in cloth caps playing dominoes in the corner. A crowd of sailors in their bell-bottoms and tight vests gathered about the dartboard, and a couple of middle-aged women with overpainted faces sat smoking and chatting with Sam, who had returned to his place behind the counter. His barmaid, lolling with her elbows on the counter, was whispering to an airman. The grubby little backstreet pub had an air of friendliness that eased Elsie's sadness. Needless to say, she hadn't set eyes on Geoffrey since that morning. She had a fleeting thought that he might be appalled if he saw her now, his prim and proper wife contentedly drinking gin and orange among overflowing ashtrays full of dog ends. Suddenly, she didn't care. This was the happiest she'd been all day, and she had a scrap of a girl with bright green eyes to thank for it. She took a deep breath and said to Izzy, "I'm going to miss you, and I mean every word of that." Izzy brushed strands of curly hair from her eyes and said quietly,
"I'll miss you and all. Drink up. You need another."
Then she looked keenly at Elsie and asked,
"I think it's time you told me what's been making you miserable all day."
Elsie stared at her. She was saved her explanation by Pat and Connie, two workers from Priddy's who had risen from their chairs and needed to squeeze past.
"'Scuse us."
They wanted to dance on the postage stamp space of floor to the Glenn Miller music. Elsie, her heart beating fast, stood up. Once the giggling girls had passed them, Izzy held Elsie's gaze and said softly,
"You can't fool me. I know something's wrong."
Elsie's happy mood slithered away. Despite her good intentions, she could no longer hold back her emotions. The kindness in Izzy's voice opened the floodgates, and through hiccups and tears, Elsie blurted out her story.
"He also wants to sell the house, and there's nothing I can do about that." "There's no point in causing yourself more grief by not going along with his wishes."
Izzy put a hand over Elsie's fingers to stop them worrying at a loose thread in her skirt. She lifted Elsie's glass.
"Finish this."
Wordlessly, Elsie obeyed. She used her hand to wipe her eyes, then delved into her bag for a 10-shilling note.
"You get some more drinks,"
she sniffed. Izzy was foraging in her handbag. She came up with a worn newspaper cutting.
"Don't let anyone else see this,"
she said, pressing the paper into Elsie's hand. Elsie smoothed it and focused on it as best she could through the smoky atmosphere and the remnants of her tears. The Grand Union Carrying Company requires women to work boats. How would you like to transport a boat carrying valuable supplies along England's waterways? You'll be doing essential war work. Full training given. Telephone. Elsie stared at her. "So this is where you're going?" She took another look at the telephone number as though she could gain more information from it if it was imprinted on her brain. Izzy nodded.
"You know I had a day off work to go for an interview. I waited for them to write to me, and I was accepted. What can you lose by doing the same? Let me know what you think when I come back."
Izzy swept up the 2 empty glasses. Elsie again scrutinised the advertisement.
"It would be a completely new start,"
Izzy said, moving away. A bubble of excitement rose in Elsie's breast. Could she? Would she have confidence enough to apply for a job like this? Full training given, it said. Apart from her war effort at Priddy's, Elsie hadn't worked outside the home since she'd given up teaching to marry Geoffrey. Again, she looked at the newspaper article. No address, only the telephone number.
What do you think, then?
Izzy, back again, put down the 2 drinks on the table.
I don't have to beg you to keep this under your hat, do I? This is our secret, yours and mine.
Izzy's eyes were shining.
We might even end up working together.
But I don't know what they'll expect of me.
Neither did I, until I went for the interview. There was a woman who explained everything. She asked me loads of questions, and I never thought I'd hear from her again, but, well,
she shrugged.
The rest is history. Just be honest and be yourself.
Elsie knew nothing about boats. In fact, the only vessel she'd ever sailed on was the ferry that ran between Gosport and Portsmouth. And what did she know of the canals? She was sure somewhere at home there was a book on their history. Later tonight she might hunt it out. In that moment Elsie knew she would telephone the number on the piece of paper tomorrow morning, as soon as Geoffrey had left for work, assuming, of course, that he returned home this evening.
"Put it away,"
hissed Izzy. Pat and Connie had returned to the table, talking loudly about their dancing partners. Elsie slipped the piece of paper into her handbag. Both women worked on the line alongside Elsie and Izzy. Of course, they knew nothing of Izzy leaving Priddy's. Connie, who was dark-haired and looked a little like Vivian Lee, said with a giggle,
"I think we've clicked with those 2 sailors."
Soon the 4 girls were chatting. Then Connie was telling them about her sister's friend.
"She's bagged herself a business bloke."
Connie gulped at her gin and orange.
"Mind you, even at school, Sandra was a tart. It's a wonder she didn't find herself in the pudding club long ago. Of course, he's married. Not that she'd let that stop her."
Elsie realised they were discussing her husband's affair. She listened silently. Apparently, gushed Pat, Sandra Eaton had bleached her mousy blonde hair and gone after anything in trousers since she'd left school. The opposite sex were fascinated by her large bosom. After a series of jobs, she'd ended up as a typist in a Gosport office.
"Sandra usually gets what she wants,"
Connie assured them, drinking the last of her gin. The 2 sailors had returned to take Pat and Connie onto the floor again. When the girls had swept away, Izzy said,
"I'm sorry you had to hear that. They didn't know that awful Sandra had set out to take your man. You know how the girls at the factory love a good gossip."
Elsie squeezed Izzy's hand. She had no intention of dissolving into tears again to give Pat and Connie even more to talk about, but neither did she want to stay any longer in the little pub that had become a den of torture. "I have to go," she said. "Write to me. You have no idea how much I'm going to miss you, Izzy. Stay safe." Elsie hugged Izzy, waved to Pat and Connie in the sailors' arms, and then fought her way outside. It wasn't long before she was hurrying up the high street towards the bus station. Arriving home to an empty house, she discovered a note on the kitchen table telling her that Geoffrey would be staying with Sandra because he didn't want any more distress. Elsie tore it up. She hadn't wanted any distress at all. Looking in the wardrobe and drawers, she found he'd taken sufficient clothing to last a few days. In the bathroom there was a space where his razor and shaving brush had been. Staring at the gaps on the shelf brought fresh tears. "It's not worth crying over," Elsie tried to assure herself. "Think of all the times you might just as well have not been in the same room for all the notice he took of you. It was as if you were invisible." She curled up in bed, but unable to sleep, she eventually went downstairs to forage through bookshelves, finally returning to the bedroom with a cup of tea, a book about the English canals, some notepaper and a pencil. Sipping the tea and reading about the birth of the canals in the 1790s was soothing and distracting. She was amazed by what she learned. A 2,000-mile network of waterways stretched across the country, providing not only access to rural idylls, but also an efficient transport route. She felt cheered by the pictures of charming brick bridges, stretches of water intersected by wooden lift bridges, and deep locks to change water levels. There were aqueducts and tunnels, and, above all, the sheer beauty of the countryside through which the network ran. Within stepping distance of the canals, there were lock cottages, pubs, and quaint villages. Pictures of the vessels intrigued her. Long craft painted with bright gypsy-like designs of castles and roses. Brass-covered boats and barges, the metal polished to a high shine, and lace curtains at round windows. Feeling herself sliding into sleep, despite Geoffrey's devastating news, Elsie closed the book and tried to decide on her next step. It would be to write on the notepaper exactly what she intended to say to whoever answered the telephone when she rang tomorrow about the job. It was important that she asked for an interview, where and when and what would be expected of her. She needed to know about accommodation, wages, food, uniforms, the boats, the training, the routes. When eventually Elsie dropped off to sleep, the pencil still clutched in her fingers, her last thought was of a narrowboat gently cruising along a leafy waterway with ripples of water nudging against the craft's wooden sides. Chapter 4. Tallulah Whitehead threaded the damp tea towel through the metal handles of the range in the kitchen of the Currant Bun Cafe and sighed. This was her last afternoon in the village of Titchfield, working in the tiny cafe for Mrs. Simmons, who had taken her on as a chubby girl of 14 to be a waitress and helper, and had taught her all she knew about baking cakes, buns, pastries, and pies. If it wasn't for the dreadful decision that the cafe had to close, Tolly would be happily making tea there for evermore. However, the war, or rather, the difficulty of obtaining sufficient sugar, flour, butter, and all the necessities needed for baking quality food, had caused 70-year-old Edith Simmons to decide to shut up shop. "You can buy the premises off me, Tolly," Edith said. "I'm in no hurry for payment." The older woman sat down heavily on an upright chair next to a table and added, "There's no one I'd rather see carry on here than you." Everyone called Tallulah Tolly. She had been named after the actress Tallulah Bankhead, a great success in the play The Little Foxes. Tolly's mother had been so taken with Miss Bankhead's performance that the following year, when Tolly's sister was born, the new baby girl was named Regina, after Tallulah Bankhead's character. Regina had soon become Reggie. "We can come to a mutual arrangement about the price," Edith offered. She had once baked at the Savoy Hotel in London. She stared at Tolly expectantly. "If you can't afford to keep open, then it doesn't matter who owns the Currant Bun Cafe. There'll be no profits without good food," returned Tolly, as she looked sadly around the pristine interior she loved. Everything had been cleared away, but Tolly was reluctant to leave. A last cup of tea had been the answer for both women. If it wasn't for the war, Tolly would have gone on bended knees to beg, steal or borrow the money to own the bow-windowed cafe. It was everything she desired as premises and as a job. Set in Titchfield's picturesque square, the street door opened straight into the cafe, with 6 tables seating 4 customers each. The highly polished counter, with its glass shelving, normally displayed cakes and sandwiches, and was home to the till and crockery. It separated the cafe from the kitchen. Alongside the kitchen, a passageway led out to a wildflower garden overlooking fields with cows. A glass conservatory was furnished with tables and chairs. Potted plants abounded, and another door led onto a lawn, where, in the height of summer, several iron tables and chairs were set out. They overlooked the little stream at the very bottom of the property. Opening at 1 in the afternoon, the mornings were reserved for baking, or had been, until the exceptionally busy cafe's popularity had dwindled without its usual mouth-watering offerings for sale. Edith lived in the small flat above the cafe. Once the premises had been sold, She was going to move to share her sister's bungalow in nearby Lee-on-the-Solent. Tolly had been a fast learner, and now, at 19, she had developed into a rounded woman with an even more rounded and happy disposition. Her father, a part-time fireman and Titchfield tomato nurseryman, and her sister Reggie, who worked in the village hat shop, understood that Tolly wouldn't be able to cope with the pain of passing the closed-down cafe each day. Tolly knew if her dad had had money to lend her, he'd have done so willingly. "Are you going to be happy leaving the village?" Edith began pouring fresh tea for herself and Tolly. On the white tablecloth, gleaming china cups and saucers sat next to a plate of fresh scones. Edith was aware that Tolly had already applied for another job. She'd seen an advertisement in the newspaper. To their surprise, her application had resulted in a successful interview. "Not really," Tolly shrugged. "It's been explained to me that there will be 2 women assigned to each narrowboat. We'll live and sleep aboard." "They're quite long, the boats, aren't they?" Edith asked. She poured milk into the cups. "They're also barely 7 feet wide. I was given a tour," Tolly explained. "I hope I won't get in my partner's way. I'd be happy if the boats were wider." "I expect the other girl is feeling just as apprehensive," Edith said to pacify her. "What if she has annoying habits? What if I irritate her?" Oh dear. It was all becoming very complicated, thought Tolly. "Best to take each day as it comes," said Edith, splitting a sweet-smelling floury scone and spreading it with margarine. "This should be served with homemade jam and lots of cream," she grumbled. Tolly knew there wasn't any, and Edith's mouth had now set in a hard, thin line of disgust. Tolly thought about Dorothy Trent, the woman who had interviewed her and who had asked, "Won't you miss the village dances? A young girl like you might find life dull on the waterways." Tolly had stared at the neat woman in grey slacks and a pink puff-sleeve jumper. She'd decided that if Dorothy Trent hadn't worn her dark hair pulled back in such a severe bun, she would have looked much prettier. "When my sister and I go to dances, she's always the one on the floor, and I'm the wallflower. So I don't think the lack of dancing will bother me." Tolly didn't share with her a conversation she'd overheard in the local hall at the last dance she'd attended. "There's no way that fat bitch is Reggie's sister. She must be adopted," said one of the boys, a sweet-looking blonde lad that Tolly had hoped might ask her to dance. She knew then that they all saw her as a blob, the ugly sister of the very pretty Reggie. Dorothy Trent had smiled at her. After a while she'd said, "I think that's all I need to know. I'll be in touch." And in less than a week, her acceptance had come by post. Tolly thought it was a good thing the woman hadn't asked her about boyfriends. There had been one man Tolly had been interested in, and Norman had started out as a pen friend. They'd written to each other for 6 months. When Norman had asked for a photograph, Tolly had sent him a Head and Shoulders print. The one from Norman had showed him with some army friends. He was the taller man with fine, fair hair, his hand resting on a pal's shoulder. They'd arranged to meet when he next had leave. Excitedly, Tolly had caught the bus into Fareham, where she was supposed to meet him outside the Embassy Cinema. She tried to imagine she hadn't seen the disappointment on his face. During the interval, he bought her an ice cream, but their chatter gradually tailed off to silence. When the film ended and they stood together in the foyer, Norman said he had to go and meet a friend. He walked her to the bus station and waited until the Titchfield bus arrived. Tolly knew then she wouldn't see him again. He hadn't exactly told her the reason, but she knew it was because of her size. Once she was home again, she shut herself in her bedroom and cried, but eventually had to let Regina in. "I'm too big. It put him off. But you know, I've tried to diet and nothing seems to work. Sometimes I think the only way I can make a man care for me is if I throw myself at him." Reggie had put her arms around her sister. "And what kind of a man would allow you to do that? Anyone would think by the way you're talking that you're enormous, and you're not. Well padded, maybe.
I think Norman wasn't the right person for you. If he'd bothered to see deep inside you, he'd have found a kind, sensitive girl." Then she'd made Tolly laugh when she said, "He's not the only cake on the shelf." When the letter came accepting her as a narrowboat woman, Tolly was overjoyed. She was nimble on her feet, hard-working, and she knew how to cook, so if nothing else, she'd make sure everyone's belly was filled. Dorothy had explained that many of the men working the canal boats on the inland waterways had joined up and were now away fighting. The scheme to ask women to take over the men's jobs hadn't been as widely advertised as the need for land girls and women to join the services and munitions factories. However, it was a necessary job. Timber, coal, iron, cement and steel had to be moved from London to Birmingham and surrounding areas, and it was considered safer, due to the bombing, to tow materials by boat than to drive vehicles on the roads. "Thank you." Tolly accepted the scone from Edith. "I shall miss you. You've taught me a great deal," she said, then bit into the crumbling softness. At least, working away from Titchfield, she wouldn't see her beloved workplace sold and turned into something quite different. "I've no idea what the future will bring, but I actually feel as though a new chapter is beginning," Tolly said, determined to make the best of a bad job. Chapter 5. The following morning it was raining when Elsie set off on her bike for the munitions factory. She'd thought about taking her car, a small black Austin, but after making the phone call to the number on the advertisement and talking to a woman called Dorothy Trent, she had decided to save her petrol ration for the journey to Lower Hayford in a few days' time. "I've had a cancellation and can fit you in for an interview if you're willing to come here." Dorothy's educated voice and the reassuring way she answered each of her queries swayed Elsie immediately. The agreed time for the interview was 3:00. Elsie explained she needed to plan her route and allow time for the possibility of losing her way. She decided, as she returned the phone to its cradle, that she would take an overnight case and stay at an inn or bed and breakfast. She was due 2 days off from Priddy's, and it might be fun to look around the area, whether the interview went favourably or not. That morning, the exacting work at the factory went slowly. The wireless cheered the workers, and the chatter was just as loud, but, without Izzy, Elsie felt alone and lost. That morning, she'd felt something similar, getting up to an empty house and making breakfast for herself that she hadn't wanted to eat. There was no word from Geoffrey. Elsie refused to cry again. When her shift finished for the day, Elsie half expected Charlie to be outside the main gate waiting for her, to wheedle information from her of Izzy's whereabouts. When she didn't see him, she cycled home, relieved, and spent the evening deciding what to wear on Thursday and charting her way to Oxfordshire on a road map. However, on Wednesday morning, Charlie was outside the factory. He got out of his Chrysler and barred her way. Dark-haired and brown-eyed, the good-looking man's easy smile didn't reach his eyes as he said, "Izzy isn't at home. Her mother won't answer the door, but a neighbour told me she'd left in a taxi." "What makes you think I know where she is?" said Elsie. She sensed he was keeping his temper in check. "You're mates, aren't you?" He stared hard at her. She took a deep breath. "Depends what you mean by that. We work together. She didn't turn up yesterday." Elsie hated lies and was determined to keep to the truth where possible. "So you expected her to come into work?" "It wasn't her day off. Have you asked our boss?" Charlie was very close to Elsie, and she could smell his musky scent. Her heart was thumping, but she knew it was to her advantage to act as though she knew nothing. The difficulty was that she was aware this calm, cold man could change in an instant to someone to be scared of. But she'd made a promise to Izzy, and she would keep her friend's secret at all costs. "Why would I ask your boss?" His eyes had narrowed. "He might know the reason she's not in work." Elsie barely got those words out before the wail of the siren cut through the air. Charlie uttered an oath.
Never before had Elsie been glad to hear moaning Minnie. Without a further glance at Charlie, she threw her bicycle against the wall and ran through the main gate to the workers' shelter. Jock, the gate manager, waved her inside, recognising her as a regular worker. Charlie, not being an employee, couldn't follow, so the last Elsie saw of him was his dash to his motor to start it up. She breathed a sigh of relief as the car turned and sped back down Weevil Lane. The brick-built shelter was already full of people. One of the men from the packing department made space for her on the bench inside the doorway and said, "Won't it be marvellous when all this is over?" He then foraged in his work bag and took out a flask. Elsie knew he would offer the first drink to her, and she would accept gratefully. Not just because she was parched, but because she was relieved Charlie had gone, for now. She thought of Charlie's good looks, which were enough to ensnare any woman. Trouble was, you never knew what any husband or boyfriend was capable of until it happened. Look at Geoffrey and his Sandra. Who would have thought Elsie's life could change in such a way? Actually, the more she thought about it, it seemed incredible that a woman like Sandra should fall in love with a fuddy-duddy like Geoffrey, with his sober way of dressing and his narrow outlook on life. Yes, he had a brilliant legal brain, but he didn't always live in the real world. Elsie pushed him from her mind as she sipped the hot, sweet tea. Her neighbour had pressed a mug into her hands with a gruff, "Here you are, love." She was sitting near the open doorway of the below-ground shelter. Eventually, she passed back the mug, then watched the area of sky that was visible to her. She saw a sinister black shape with a pointed nose and fins. A huge gush of air, flame red, spurted from its rear end, like some majestic tail. Even with the noise from the people around her in the shelter, the whine it made was fearsome. Mesmerised, she watched, and the ear-splitting sound cut out. Then the machine seemed to hover before it nosedived to earth. The explosion that followed was terrifying. Spirals of thick black smoke hurled themselves into the air. Elsie had no idea where the self-propelled V1 had landed, but the morning sky was now filled with the dirty black and grey mist too thick to see through. She shuddered. The man beside her, sensing her disquiet, said softly, "Try not to think about it, love." Elsie looked into his face. He was kind. He probably had a wife and family somewhere and was praying they were safe. She gave him a small smile. She had no idea how long she sat there, sandwiched between people she didn't know. The one thing she was aware of was that if a V1 hit the factory, with all the munitions stored there, within seconds she would be no more. A cheer went up as the all-clear sounded, followed by the bells and horns of emergency vehicles approaching the black dust cloud. Employees began trickling from their hiding places. Work would go on as normal now at the factory. Elsie ventured out and walked through the crowds of people to retrieve her bicycle and put it away. Afterwards, the day progressed as any other. She doubted she'd seen the last of Charlie, but the future would take care of itself. Tomorrow, she was driving to Lower Hayford for her interview. Elsie had still had no word from Geoffrey, but she was beginning to find peace in the silence around the house. Her own company suited her, and although it had only been a couple of days since Geoffrey had left, she relished being able to eat when and what she wanted, even though her appetite had deserted her. She could also listen to wireless programs that Geoffrey had decried as silly, and reading in bed without him huffing and puffing about the light being kept on too long was liberating. She had decided to wear her grey costume with a white blouse and large bow at the neck. She felt the costume to be a lucky article of clothing. With her black court shoes and matching black handbag, she felt ready to face Dorothy Trent, who had sounded so positive on the telephone. Lower Hayford was a small place, containing a steepled church with fine stained glass windows. The village looked deserted, except for 3 children sitting by the roadside taking down car numbers. A watermill stood on the banks of the Charwell. A clapboarded building, partly hidden by trees, looked over the river. It didn't take her long to find the Bull, a public house near the canal. She had been advised to turn down a small lane to reach the boatyard. Elsie had gauged the time well, for she was only half an hour early, and, after parking the car, decided she would take a short walk alongside the canal before she knocked on the door of the boatyard's office. An elderly man waved to her from a moored boat. Just like the village, the yard seemed practically deserted. Elsie looked with interest at the canal boats moored along wooden jetties. Each was named after a bird. They were much longer than she'd envisaged, and seemed to be moored in pairs. A workboat was coupled with another that looked as though its space was possibly habitable. Elsie hoped she'd be shown over one. "Hello?" The voice made her jump, for she was deep in thought. When she turned to face its owner, she was surprised to see a woman of a similar age to herself. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun that made her face look severe, but the tone of her voice and her smiling eyes suggested otherwise. "Are you Dorothy Trent?" The woman nodded. "And you must be Elsie." She turned and walked with a slight limp towards the clapboard building, Elsie following. At the door, she twisted the handle and stepped aside so Elsie could enter the tidy office. "Sit down," Dorothy said, and busied herself with the primus stove that stood on the side. "Did you have a good journey up from Gosport?" Elsie immediately felt at ease. "Yes, I did." She took a chair in front of the desk and watched as Dorothy, who was slim and wore navy slacks with a pale blue jumper, prepared tea. Within 10 minutes, she had blurted out her real reason for wanting to escape from Gosport. Half an hour later, Dorothy had explained that the job vacancies had not been widely advertised, but that trips from Limehouse in London to Birmingham, via Coventry and other routes, delivered goods to factories. There were no extra coupons for work clothing, no uniform given. The pay was £2 a week, with food and accommodation included. 2 women were needed for each vessel. One's a diesel-powered boat, the other's a butty, an engineless craft towed by the one with the engine. To live in close proximity with someone you've never met before can be quite eye-opening. Mentally and physically, it's hard work. Probably like nothing you've ever tackled in your life. She paused. Elsie knew Dorothy hadn't meant to sound patronising. "Normally I'm on the boats, but I hurt my foot, so I'm recuperating. I'm back aboard on Monday. I've taken over interviewing trainees to give the other woman who usually does this job a much-needed break. Although working on the narrowboats is a reserved occupation, many of the men have joined the services, so we need all the help we can get." Elsie could sense the strength in Dorothy's mind and body. It was easy to imagine her in charge of one of the long, narrow boats. A seed of doubt entered Elsie's head. The romantic notion she'd had from reading the advertisement was nothing like the actual work involved. Could she do it? Could she learn something different in entirely new surroundings? If she was offered the chance, she'd take it. One thing was certain. She wouldn't have time to dwell on Geoffrey and Sandra and their baby. Living and working on a boat wouldn't give her time to mourn the loss of her beloved house and garden either. As she sipped at the strong tea, she listened eagerly to all that Dorothy had to say. End of CD 1. CD 2. Chapter 6. Have you ever been on a boat before? Elsie walked swiftly to keep up with Dorothy. "Only to cross on the ferry from Gosport to Portsmouth," she said. "It's a very short trip." Deftly, Dorothy slid herself into the moored narrowboat, waited for Elsie to join her, smiling, as Elsie had to hoist her skirt to climb in awkwardly over the side. Dorothy pushed back the hatch and went down the small steps into the cabin. "Bring as few belongings as possible.
As you can see, there's little room for your things, said Dorothy. It gets very hot in here, so we keep the hatch open most of the time.
Elsie could smell coal dust and something sharp that made her want to sneeze. A small black-leaded stove was obviously used for heating and cooking. Dorothy slid back a small partition to reveal cups and plates stacked neatly. Next to it, another cupboard held canisters marked tea and sugar. "The larder," Dorothy said. There were also some tins of condensed milk. "You'll soon get used to tea with that in it. We can't always get fresh milk," she added. "Don't forget to bring your ration book with you." Elsie nodded. "There's not a lot more to show you, except your bed and the engine, and I don't want to frighten you off with that." Dorothy swung back a curtain, revealing a small square of wood barely 2 foot wide. "During the day, it's a table, but at night it converts into bed space." Dorothy put her hand on a cupboard beneath the table. "Inside here are extra blankets. Most girls bring their own sleeping bags. Space is at premium, so everything has a double use. I thought 2 people were needed on each boat. You want to know where the other bed's hidden?" "Yes, please." On the far side of the boat, there was another long cupboard. Let down, the plywood door revealed a space barely wide enough for a person to sleep, stuffed with a pillow, sleeping bag and blanket. "My quarters," said Dorothy. "Don't worry. Some nights you'll be so tired and cold that when you come in you'd willingly sleep on the floor and find it comfortable." Elsie liked the woman's honesty, her directness, but sensed she was hiding something. Not about the job and its requirements. For anything Elsie asked, she replied too quickly, with precision. She was just sure there was more to Dorothy than she was letting on. A thought struck Elsie. "Who looks after the engines?" Dorothy turned to her, and Elsie caught a whiff of floral perfume. "We do." Elsie's face must have showed amazement, for Dorothy laughed. "It's not so bad. Anything we can't cope with as a team, we get in touch with the office here, and they'll send out someone. But we're doing men's jobs, and there's not much we can't do that they can." Dorothy stamped on the floor. "The engine room's below. The diesel Lister engine uses a very high cylinder compression to start the ignition process, unlike the petrol engine, which needs a spark. Regular servicing is recommended, and we'll take turns, you included." Elsie had begun to think she'd like the challenge of something new when Dorothy added, "The first trip will be to Limehouse in London. You're travelling on this boat with me. We'll be empty on the way there, but collect materials to deliver on the return trip. The exact route I'm not sure of yet. It could be coal from a coalfield near Coventry, or wood, possibly metal bars. The round trip normally takes 3 or 4 weeks. We'll check in at various points along the way. An experienced crew would do it quicker, but beginners need a lunch break and regular hours. Look," she paused. "If you're agreeable, the next step is a medical. I can tell you straight away, I think you and I will get along fine. We leave here on Monday, and I'd like you to join me. I can arrange for Dr. Wells to do the medical tomorrow morning before his surgery hours. If you pass that, the job's yours, and later you'll receive official notification. But on Monday morning, we leave at 6. How about it?" The pay was well below what Elsie was earning at Priddy's, but on the plus side, the job was away from Gosport. She would need to tell Geoffrey she was leaving the house. Without having to pay for her keep, she might even be able to save her wages. "Monday," Dorothy nodded. "Twisting this stupid ankle has kept me out of action, so I'm behind with deliveries. I've also had to put up a young woman at a nearby hostelry while I recovered. I'd like to tell her to come on Monday, too." "I understand," Elsie said, making up her mind. "How about letters?" "You can have them redirected here. That's what the girls do. There are also collection points at post offices along the waterways. Anything else she needed to know, she would be taught." Elsie thought she and Dorothy would get along fine together, though she wondered what the girls in the butty boat would be like. She had no doubt she would pass the medical in the morning, and she was glad she'd brought an overnight case. She decided she would return to Gosport after she'd seen the doctor, then come back and spend a few days before departure looking around the area. "Will the Bull put me up?"
They'll be glad to have you. The other girl arrived when they were fully booked for a local wedding, so she's staying a few miles away. I suggest you book in now and ask for your bill to be charged to this base." "Oh, that sounds good," Elsie said. "If you don't pass the medical, at least you'll leave with the memory of a little luxury," said Dorothy. "The Bull's meals are top-notch. Of course, you won't have much time to sort out your affairs back in Gosport." Elsie thought of her empty house, the few clothes she wanted to pack, and the letter she would leave for Geoffrey. "I won't need much," she said. Elsie drove fast back to Gosport. She'd booked into the Bull until Monday morning. The doctor had assured her she was as fit as a fiddle. As she turned down Western Way, her heart dropped as she spied the Chrysler parked on the road outside her house. She drove straight into her driveway, but before she turned her key in the lock, a figure loomed menacingly beside her. The man was so tall. Dark curls fell across his forehead from beneath his trilby. He leaned with an easy grace against the doorframe. "Enjoy your trip? You didn't come home last night?" Elsie's heart was pounding against her ribs. What right had he to comment on her whereabouts? "How did you know where I live?" Now she was angry. "I don't have to report my comings and goings to you." "Of course not. Except if you'd gone to visit Izzy." "Don't be stupid. I told you I don't know where she is." This, at least, was the truth. Charlie put his hand on her arm. Immediately he touched her, Elsie shrank away from him. "Not scared of me, are you?" He leaned in closer, and she could smell his sandalwood cologne. Her heart beat even faster. He still hadn't told her how he'd known where to find her. He was towering over her. One of his hands rose towards her cheek, and with exaggerated gentleness, he tucked a strand of her fair hair behind her ear. Remembering the bruises and welts she'd seen on Izzy's skin, she tried hard not to show her fear. She looked out into the street. Of course, it was deserted. "Why should I be scared of you?" She tried to laugh. Then she took a deep breath and repeated, "Izzy isn't here with me. I have no idea where she is." "I know she's not living with you," he snapped. "But I think you know more than you're saying." He let his hand fall. Elsie was relieved when he took a step away from her. "Don't think you've seen the last of me." He leaned forward again, his breath hot against her ear as he spoke. "It didn't take me long to find you, and I always get what I want." Then he turned and walked back down the driveway towards his car. Once she was inside, Elsie slammed the front door and leaned against the wood. Her hands were sweaty with fear. She'd made herself take deep breaths, and when she finally felt easier, she went into the front room and stared out of the window until the Chrysler had gone. After a cup of tea, she felt better and switched on the wireless to listen to the news. The Germans were leaving the Channel Islands, occupied since 1940. Elsie was happy to hear the good news, but the bad news was the Germans had perfected the V2 rocket, which was even deadlier than the V1. She'd asked Dorothy whether many bombs had fallen on the villages alongside the canals. She'd been told that sometimes German pilots saved fuel by jettisoning bombs they hadn't dropped on targets. A fortnight ago, one had landed in Farmer Wilkes's field. Elsie had smiled inwardly, remembering her fear in the air raid shelter at Priddy's. The countryside certainly wasn't Hitler's priority. Dance music now filled the rooms as she packed a holdall. Winter trousers and as many jumpers as she could fit in, along with her thick nighties, her toiletries and underwear. None of her clothes matched, but they were warm and serviceable, and that was what mattered. She jammed in the black Wellingtons she wore in the garden and a pair of white canvas flat shoes. Remembering the difficulty her skirt had caused when she was stepping onto the boat, she dispensed with her suit, hanging it in her wardrobe, and picked a cotton skirt just in case. Deciding she would eat when she returned to the Bull, Elsie ran a bath, remembering to be careful with the water, in accordance with wartime regulations. While she bathed, she thought of the words she would use to explain her disappearance to Geoffrey.
She must also write to her boss at Priddy's, apologising for her decision to leave. Her job would soon be filled by someone else because it paid well, but, still, it wasn't in her nature to let people down without an explanation. She had a stamp, so she could post that letter. The one to her husband she decided to leave on the kitchen table. Sooner or later he would return to raid his wardrobe again. She would also have to give him the address of the boatyard. Geoffrey would no doubt be happy she had decided to leave Gosport. He had offered her money for another property when the sale of the house went through, and she didn't want him to forget that promise. Elsie came down from the bathroom swathed in her dressing gown. She went out into the back garden for a last look around. It was still light and warm, a lovely summer's evening. She would miss the garden, miss sitting out on the lawn beneath the trees reading. Quickly she dismissed the thoughts that were making her feel sad. She turned to go back inside. A flower pot containing a geranium lay broken in the border near the back door. She stared at it. It had fallen or been knocked from the sill. Had someone tried to enter the back of the house while she'd been away? Elsie pushed away the thought. Back inside, she sat at the table and wrote the 2 letters. Then she dressed in dark green slacks and a light green jumper. She decided on her gabardine raincoat and sensible flat shoes. Twisting her hair up and jamming in grips, she finished her tea while she made sure she had everything she needed, including a couple of books to read, an Agatha Christie she had already started, and James Hilton's Random Harvest. As an afterthought, she packed the canal book. She went towards the front door. A thought struck her. She sped back to the kitchen and searched in the drawer for the packet of candles she kept in case of emergencies, and found a space for them, with a box of matches, in the corner of her holdall. It was dusk as she closed the door behind her, telling herself that she mustn't cry. "This," she said softly, "is a new beginning." Chapter 7. Geoffrey rolled over in Sandra's small bed. The air in the room tasted of stale sweat and sex. He longed to open the window, but Sandra couldn't abide draughts. He didn't want to wake her, but he needed to get comfortable. His face met fur that crept into his eyes, up his nose and into his mouth. "Get off!" His hand made contact with Sandra's cantankerous Persian cat, and he swept it from the pillow. He heard a flop and a disgruntled meow as the cat landed on the lino, then felt the bounce as it jumped onto Sandra's side of the bed. Sandra idolised Fluffy, and Geoffrey hated the orange devil. Of course he was aware that, cats being cats and clever creatures, Fluffy understood this, so she slept on his suits until he had found space to hang them up. She'd been sick in his shoes. He'd also found deep gouges and scratch marks where she had sharpened her claws on his Italian leather briefcase. When Geoffrey was standing up, the feline wove in and out of his ankles, purring, as though she knew how much he disliked the long orange hairs that clung to his trouser turn-ups and socks. Geoffrey looked at the clock on the bedside table. It was too early to get up and too late to go back to sleep. Sandra slept as though she were dead. He remembered that in the galley kitchen the sink was still full of last night's dirty crockery. He thought of the frying pan covered with grease and shuddered. Sandra wasn't as house-proud as Elsie. Still, he couldn't have everything, could he? So far, she had never refused him when he felt like making love, and he enjoyed the feel of her silky thighs across his legs and the large breasts he could bury his face in. But she was very untidy. She never thought to put things away, so when he wanted something, anything, he usually had to burrow among piles of clothing to find what he was looking for. She'd said that if she had a bigger house, things wouldn't get lost so easily. He couldn't argue with that. Sandra also ate at unconventional times, and often forgot about supper, which was his main meal of the day, except for the previous night, when she had provided him with a blackened and greasy fry-up. Different smells made her nauseous. She said it was her pregnancy. Sometimes he cooked for her, the idea alien to him when he was living with Elsie. It was much cheaper than eating out, which was one of Sandra's pleasures. Another of her pleasures was dressing him up. So far, he'd managed to get away with not wearing the pork pie hat, or the wide, bright ties he thought made him look like an out-of-work comedian. God only knew where she managed to obtain fashionable clothing for herself and him without coupons. Sandra said she knew people.
For goodness sake, 40 isn't old. Those dark suits make you look like an undertaker.
Perhaps he shouldn't have been so hasty in agreeing to move into the small basement flat in the Crescent, though it hadn't seemed so small when Sandra, with the estate agent, had shown him around it. Geoffrey certainly didn't think the mortgage was low, and he should know he'd been paying it for the last few months. Sandra put out her arm, momentarily trapping him in the bed. He could hear the cat purring. Any moment now, the blasted thing would come over to his side and plump itself down again on his pillow. Perhaps he'd get up and have a quick cup of tea. Then he could return to his house in Western Way and collect more clothes, which would be hair-free. Of course, he had other things at Sandra's flat, but they weren't suitable for work. There was a funny-looking suit hanging on the back of the door that Sandra had catched from an African-American Marine one night in the Swan. She said she'd won it in a bet. Geoffrey didn't ask questions. Sandra insisted he try it on. He didn't like it at all. The jacket made him feel as though his arms were too long, and the gathered trouser hems reminded him of Aladdin's outfits in the pantomime. Geoffrey didn't know how to refuse her.
I don't want people to think I'm living with my granddad, she'd wailed. That's the latest fashion in America.
5 minutes later, Geoffrey was in the minuscule kitchen, and with the door closed on the sleeping woman and her cat, he was tying his shoelaces. Or he would have been if one lace and insole hadn't felt damp. He left it to dangle. 10 minutes later, tea forgotten, he opened the front door to a sunny, late August morning. Geoffrey breathed a sigh of relief. As he walked to his car, he looked back at the flat. Those living quarters were definitely not for him. Bought for Sandra, so she could live away from her family in Old Road, he'd thought the love nest perfect for visits when she told him gleefully of the pregnancy. So overjoyed was he that at last he was to become a father. He would have bought Buckingham Palace if it had been available. He wondered about the possibility of Elsie agreeing to a straight swap while they waited for a house buyer. Elsie in the flat, himself and Sandra in the larger property. That would be ideal. Alas, Elsie definitely wouldn't like that. Oh well, he'd have to advertise to sell the marital home. The Gosport roads were quiet, the warmth of the new day already cheering him as he entered leafy Western Way. Geoffrey drove into the driveway and parked. Out of the car, he stood for a moment, looking at the house on which he and Elsie had lavished care and money. It was a pretty place, with its gabled walls and thatched roof. The diamond-shaped glass in the leaded windows winked in the bright sunshine. He breathed in the scents from the climbers Elsie had planted, flowering along the walls. He'd definitely be sorry to leave this house. He'd worked hard for it, and Elsie had contributed the payout she'd been given on finishing her teaching career. Of course, she hadn't been happy to give up her job, but the house and its garden had become her salvation. He'd had no say in the matter a year ago when she'd started part-time at the munitions factory, but his partner had praised his patriotism in allowing her to help the country in its hour of need. Geoffrey had no living relations other than a brother in Australia. He didn't think about Cecil very often, and they communicated even less. Since Cecil had served a term of imprisonment for embezzlement before he'd left England, Geoffrey had no wish to be reminded of him. What Geoffrey desired more than anything was to found a new dynasty of his own family, hopefully starting with a son. After all those years of childless marriage, he had thought that was impossible. Until now, with Sandra. He could smell the polish. Lavender, as usual, immediately stepped into the hall and went straight upstairs to run a bath before he ransacked his wardrobe. In the bedroom, he looked at the clock, then at the bed, which hadn't been slept in. His first thought was that Elsie had taken on an early turn at the factory. Then he noticed her open wardrobe. Nothing much seemed to be missing. She hadn't taken her best clothes, so there was no man involved. He smiled at that absurd thought. Geoffrey reached on top of the wardrobe for the large suitcase. Something was missing. Usually, the small leather holdall sat next to the case. He shrugged and began to fold underwear and shirts. Later, after an invigorating bath and a change of clothes, Geoffrey went downstairs, left the suitcase by the front door, and drifted into the kitchen. A change in the atmosphere drew his attention to the open back door. "Stupid woman," he muttered, and went to close it. That was when he saw the lock was broken. Geoffrey searched every room in the large rambling house. As far as he could make out, nothing was missing, except his wife and a small holdall. Had someone broken in? Had Elsie forgotten her key and broken the glass in the back door to gain entry? Wouldn't she have closed the door? And he felt sure she would have employed a locksmith to make good the door before she left. While Geoffrey was still searching for clues, he spotted the letter addressed to him on the table. It looked as if she had resealed the envelope. After reading the single page, he sat down at the kitchen table to get over the shock. Elsie had told him she was leaving and had given an address where he could forward letters. It was the first time she had simply told him she was doing anything. She had not mentioned the broken door lock. He telephoned for a locksmith. Then he rang his office in Gosport and said he wouldn't arrive until later in the day. His new secretary, a replacement for Sandra, a grey-haired middle-aged woman named Nellie, was to rearrange all his appointments. It occurred to Geoffrey that the only way to make sure his house in Western Way wasn't broken into again, if, indeed, Elsie had had to break in, was for him, and possibly Sandra, though she should follow later, to live in it. He picked up Elsie's letter. He would write and explain it would be easier to show prospective buyers over the property if it was lived in. Surely she couldn't argue with that. Chapter 8. Izzy stretched her arms above her head as she looked out of the window across the flower-filled gardens tumbling down towards the canal. She couldn't remember when last she'd felt such happiness, such freedom as she had while living at the Black Cow Inn. And she was being paid for this. She took a deep breath of the warm morning air, tinged with the scent of roses, listened to the comforting noise of cutlery being used in the kitchen below, and sighed as the smell of fried bread rose and enveloped her. Breakfast was cooking, and she was starving. A movement on the black-painted narrowboat caught her eyes, and she realised she was staring at a dark-clad figure who was clearly watching her. Izzy shivered. "It's not Charlie," she told herself. "It's not." She shook as fingers of fear crept up her spine. The figure put his hand to his cap, a signal that he was acknowledging her presence, then turned and disappeared into the bowels of the boat. After a while, Izzy's breathing became normal, and she realised the man she had seen was Nelson Smith, or Sonny, as he was known to the canal folk. 5 minutes! The shouted words, with a knock on her bedroom door, brought Izzy out of her reverie. "Coming!" she called back, and immediately chased away her terrified thoughts. She washed her face and hands quickly in the small corner sink, dressed, and went down to eat with the pub's employees. The kitchen was warm, and the chatter rose to greet her as she hurried into the big old-fashioned room to find Esme had saved her a seat. She smiled her thanks as she sat down next to the young barmaid and helped herself to food from the sizzling dish. Fried tomatoes, an egg and a slice of fried bread, washed down with a mug of strong, dark tea, was a treat after the meagre rationing back home in war-torn Gosport. Here, in the countryside, Izzy relished mealtimes. Customers sometimes, in lieu of payment, brought in a few farm-fresh eggs, poultry or ham. Soon she'd be helping cook her own food, and that of the other 3 women on the narrowboats, and eking out the meagre rations. Almost as if reading her thoughts, Esme said, "So, you'll be leaving us on Monday?" Izzy swallowed.
Yes, Dorothy's ankle is strong enough for her to put weight on it now, and she's ready to supervise the 2 boats travelling to London.
"You'll like working with Dorothy. She's a grand lass." This from Bert Sellers, the owner of the Black Cow, a corpulent man spreading himself at the head of the table.
"I think I will," replied Izzy. "I thought when I arrived in Lower Hayford I'd be starting work straight away, but I've enjoyed being here with you, even though it's a fair distance from the boatyard. I'm glad the Bull was fully booked with that wedding party."
Izzy smiled at the young girl next to her.
"I've loved every minute of helping out around here."
Izzy had received wages from Dorothy. It hadn't been her fault she'd been unable to fulfill her contract.
"You've changed such a lot in the short time we've known you,"
said Esme, her bobbed dark hair falling across her eyes. "You were like a frit rabbit."
"What on earth is that?"
Esme laughed. "A rabbit that's scared of traps and headlamps," she said.
"You were forever looking about you and staring into darkened corners. I thought you were afraid you'd see a ghost."
Izzy grinned back at her.
"Perhaps I was," she said. "Maybe I still am."
It had taken her a while to realise how much trust she'd placed in her mother and her friend Elsie not to give away her whereabouts to Charlie Osborne. Just a glimpse of a tall man staring at her made her panic. Remembering earlier how seeing Sonny had jolted her, she said,
"Sonny acknowledged me this morning from his boat."
Esme spluttered into her teacup. "Acknowledged? Like he waved or something?" She used her fingers to wipe her chin where the tea had spurted.
"Well, he tipped his cap."
Esme's eyes grew dreamy.
"I wish he'd known I was here."
Izzy had already gathered that the gypsy boatman with the reddest hair she'd ever seen, even brighter than her own, was considered quite a catch. "You keep away from Sonny Smith. There's many a lass wishes she'd never met him." Bert Sellers glared at his breakfast as if it was about to rear up and bite him.
"Just because you own this pub doesn't mean you know how young girls feel when a handsome man looks their way. Eat your breakfast,"
Josie, his wife of many years, said. "I know what's in that devil's heart," Bert said. "Wasn't too long ago I was like him."
"Ah, but I tamed you, didn't I, pet?"
Al, the cellar man, laughed, and pretty soon the 5 of them were giggling and chatting happily. After breakfast, Izzy and Esme elected to wash up in the stone sink, while Bert and Josie readied the pub for opening time. Al disappeared down some stone steps, muttering about changing barrels.
"I served him in the bar last night."
Izzy knew Esme would guess who she was talking about.
"What did he say, apart from asking for a drink?"
Esme was wiping a plate with a frayed tea-cloth.
"Just wanted a drink. He barely looked at me."
Izzy didn't want to say he had managed to make her feel like a 15-year-old. As she had turned from the till in the busy bar and handed him his change, it was as though a lightning bolt had passed through her. Then she'd experienced the awful feeling she'd got every time she'd left the factory at Gosport to find Charlie waiting for her. Sonny had turned towards the dartboard and challenged another local man to a game. She had watched his muscles flex beneath his pale green shirt, with the sleeves rolled high on his bronzed arms. He'd thrown the arrow so confidently. She was aware he knew his worth. He also understood the effect he was having on the women in the bar. Young and old alike couldn't tear their eyes off him. It wasn't just his height or the breadth of his shoulders. There was a boldness about him that put other men in the shade. Yet last night Izzy had averted her gaze. He reminded her too much of Charlie, and she'd had enough of Charlie to last her a lifetime. Elsie walked alongside the canal. Tomorrow morning at 6, she'd be taking this path, carrying her sleeping bag and holdall to embark on a new life, one she was looking forward to. The work would be exhausting, Dorothy had told her, so she would have little time or energy to dwell on what was going on back in Gosport with her husband and his new love. A sudden movement at the side of the canal. and she was just in time to see a rat disappear into the undergrowth below the purple rosebay growing along the towpath. In her thoughts, the canals had been filled with glistening clear water, but in reality it was a murky grey, and floating rubbish threatened to ensnare boat propellers. In the boatyard, Elsie could see the two boats tied side by side. Mallard, the one she would be sleeping on, and Bunting, the butty boat. Both were canvas covered. Mallard was the one with the engine. Elsie shuddered. What did she know about engines? Come to think of it, what did she know about narrowboats or hauling coal and other goods? Nothing, except what she'd read in her trusty canal book brought from home, and the conversation she'd had with Dorothy. Elsie knew she would tackle the job and try to make a success of it. To give in and run home to Gosport with her tail between her legs would be to admit defeat, and it wasn't in her nature to give up without a struggle. Why, then, wasn't she making more of an effort to hold on to Geoffrey? Because, deep down, she knew he was a lost cause. Through the cottage window, Dorothy watched Elsie turn and make her way back towards the bull. Should she knock on the window, run out into the garden and call her in for a cup of tea? Neighbourliness told her she should, but she turned away, the much-read letter clutched in her hand. Tomorrow would be time enough to remind the women how hard the work would be. They could also experience at first hand the wrath of the real canal folk, who mostly disliked the chit of girls who had taken over the work of their men away fighting for the country. The true water gypsies were paid by the trip, travelling with their wives and children on the waterways they had always travelled, and working as a unit. All were savvy individuals, though few could read or write. Where did they find the time for such niceties when they were always on the move? To keep the peace on the canals, the girls were paid significantly less than the water gypsies. Of course, the girls were allowed paid days off, which the canal folk were not, and because Dorothy had twisted her ankle and taken time off, she had elected to pay the girls' board and lodging herself, on the understanding that the proprietors of the two pubs kept it secret. She had the feeling that this time the girl she had chosen would take to each other and to canal life. It was important to her that she had a good crew, and that the girls found her to be beyond reproach. During the years she'd worked for the company, she had sometimes despaired of the childishness shown by grown women who'd been told what to expect from the job and what they needed to put in to gain limited success. But there had also been successful women who had gone on to take out further teams of narrowboat women, nicknamed Idle Women, as their badges proclaimed IW, for Inland Waterways. Idle they were most certainly not. Dorothy was proud of her cruise on the commercial waterway of the Grand Union Canal. It wasn't her chosen profession. Her past had dictated it. She reread the words she had stared at so many times. The letter was dated the 21st of May, 1942. It was the last communication she had received from the man she loved.
Darling Dorothy, please excuse this writing, but I'm in a lorry only a few miles from Dover. A dispatch rider caught up with us on our way back to Camberley. We have orders not to return to camp. I can only think we are on our way to France or Belgium. I will write again as soon as I can. I'll ask someone to put this in the post for me. At least you'll have some idea where I've gone if you don't hear from me soon. Love, Jakub. P.S. You mean all the world to me.
Chapter 9.
If you need anything, write.
With Regina's words ringing in her ears, Tolly watched the coach, with its barely glowing headlights, disappear round the corner of the lane. Fearing there'd be no room on the boat for a suitcase, she had jammed all her belongings, including a sleeping bag, into 4 brown carrier bags with string handles that now cut into her hands as she walked purposefully towards the boatyard. At first, She'd had mixed feelings about Regina accompanying her on the long coach journey. Her sister knew how apprehensive she was at leaving Titchfield, and wanted to satisfy herself that Tolly wasn't falling into a den of iniquity. It was 5:30, and the birds were chirpily calling to each other. Already she was out of breath. On the top of the bridge, Tolly paused to look about her. 4 ducks paddled towards the opposite bank of the canal. The air was still and clear, without the ever-present stink of destruction that Hitler's bombs had wreaked over the south coast. She breathed in deeply. A tiny well of excitement opened deep inside her. She picked up her bags again and strode purposefully towards the boatyard's entrance. Dorothy was in the office, mug in hand, chatting to a fair-haired woman of about Dorothy's age. They fell silent as Tolly let go of her bags and knocked on the open door. She was rewarded by wide smiles from the two of them.
Nice and early, I see. Welcome, Tolly. This is Elsie. She'll be bunking with me in Mallard. Your shipmate should be waiting canal-side near the Black Cow. Both of you will live aboard Bunting. Did you have a good journey up?
Tolly felt at ease immediately, especially when Elsie grinned at her and poured tea into a mug, then set it in front of her. A spoon was poised over the condensed milk tin, and Elsie looked inquiringly at her.
Yes, please. I thought we'd cook breakfast on the boat later, Dorothy said, but there's a loaf of bread and some march here if you're hungry now. We were looking at the map showing our route. I know where we're going, but sometimes it looks easier on the page.
She pushed the crumpled paper across her desk, and Tolly picked it up.
I never was any good at maps. I thought we'd get on the canal and stay there until we got where we were going, she said. Well, in theory that's correct, said Dorothy. But the map shows locks and bridges and waterways called arms that may not be navigable. Should we accidentally stray along one, we could run aground, and as all the signposts have been taken out in case of German invasion, maps are about the only tool we have for navigation.
Tolly was blushing at her own ignorance.
Once we've done the first one, you'll know exactly what I mean. Don't be afraid to ask about anything you're not sure of.
Tolly felt easier at Dorothy's words and sipped her tea. She'd not experienced condensed milk as a whitener and sweetener before, although of course she'd used it in cake-making. She remembered Dorothy explaining that cow's milk was sometimes difficult to obtain. Dorothy grabbed a jacket from the back of her chair.
We'll go when everyone's ready, she said.
Tolly asked,
Is your ankle better now?
Much, Dorothy said.
Don't either of you do the silly thing I did and think there's room for you to jump from the boat if there clearly isn't. It was stupid of me. Too many injuries occur leaping on and off boats, especially in the locks and approaching tunnels. I should also warn you against sitting on top of the boats facing the steerer. Lovely and comfortable, but remember your back is towards the cut, and you can't possibly see overhanging branches or bridges with your back to them.
Elsie made a face at Tolly, who could no more see herself leaping on and off a narrowboat than flying to the moon. Shepherded by Dorothy, Tolly and Elsie left the office, along with their luggage. Tolly found herself being led to 2 craft lying one behind the other in the basin. Other narrowboats bobbed in the water, tied together like sardines in a can.
Get aboard the second boat and stow away your things,
advised Dorothy. Izzie's short spell at the Black Cow had ended, but she would return to visit her new friends at some time in the future. Yesterday, everyone had insisted she take it easy, because she'd be starting work today, so she'd spent the afternoon in the pub gardens, reading in the sunshine. Out of the corner of her eye, she'd noticed an elderly man in a wicker bath chair, quickly turning the pages of a book. He seemed to be more interested in looking for pictures than actually reading the words. After a while, when Izzie saw he'd flicked through the chapters, come to the end and started again, she got up and went over to him. He looked up at her as her shadow fell across him.
What are you reading?
She spoke softly, as she didn't want to startle him. The man gave her a gap-toothed smile and passed her the book. Izzie saw it was a recent edition of Alexandre Dumas, The Man in the Iron Mask. The effort of moving caused him to have a coughing fit. Izzie felt guilty for disturbing him. He finally wiped his mouth with a grubby handkerchief, bright red like his neckerchief. Before he managed to tuck it into his waistcoat pocket, Izzy had noticed the spots of dark blood. Her heart went out to him. She decided no good would come of her mentioning his illness, so said instead,
"I'm not doing anything for a while, except enjoying the sun."
She flicked through the book's closely printed pages.
"Would you like me to read a little to you?"
She didn't wait for him to answer.
"I've noticed you're not wearing spectacles. This print is very tiny. I used to read to my grandmother."
This time he interrupted her.
"I like that very much."
His voice crackled with phlegm.
"If you're sure you can spare the time."
Izzy had looked at his clean, collarless shirt and corduroy trousers, brown shoes peeping out from below the turn-ups, and grinned.
"I'd be glad to," she said. "My name's Izzy."
"And I'm Stefan, but I'm known as Steve-O."
He had a wicked glint in his dark eyes. His remaining teeth were very white, his skin dark and lined.
"Right then, Steve-O. Shall I begin?"
He nodded. Izzy had realised that speaking was difficult for him. She turned to the beginning of the book and began. Although the story seemed ponderous, she went on, immersed in what she was doing. Steve-O seemed engrossed in the story. After a while she turned another page, then chanced to look and saw he was asleep. There was a woven blanket on the handles of the chair, so she put the book down, got up, gathered the covering, and draped it gently over him. Izzy was dying to go to the lavatory. Steve-O looked so comfortable, she decided to leave for a little while and carry on reading upon her return, when he might wake. She had been gone only a few minutes, but when she returned, the bath chair and Steve-O had disappeared. The book was on the table. Children were still playing on the wooden swings. Boats were moored on the canal, and customers still enjoying their drinks in the gardens. She picked up the book and wandered around, looking to see if Steve-O had magically wheeled himself away. Then she'd gone to her room to begin packing for tomorrow. Izzy hadn't had time to dwell on Steve-O's disappearance until now. She'd almost decided one of his family had reclaimed him and then they'd left the pub. Still asleep, he wouldn't have been able to say goodbye to her. Izzy decided she would keep the book until she saw him again, if she saw him. Now Izzy smiled to herself. Sitting on her coat on the damp grass, she was waiting for Dorothy to pick her up. Her bags were spread about her. The day promised to be sunny and warm. She listened to the murmur of insects in the grass and thanked God she'd escaped from Gosport and Charlie Osborne. The two boats were moored by ropes to rings along the concrete wharf. They were each about 70 feet long, Tolly reckoned. Mallard and Bunting were painted black, and both were covered with long tarpaulins, tethered firmly to keep out the weather.
"Bunting's the butty, so has no engine. I suggest you claim your sleeping area,"
Dorothy reminded Tolly.
"Both boats have been idle for a while, so that's given our staff a chance to do some cleaning, but in future that's up to us. The holds have to be kept scrupulously clean, especially after we've transported coal or cement. When you've familiarised yourself with the space, come over to us. I think it's a good idea to collect and greet our last crew member together, don't you?"
Tolly nodded in agreement. The initials GUCC were painted along the sides of the boat, with the craft's number and its name. Tolly lifted over her bags, then took a while deciding the best way for herself to climb aboard. The small ladder, a plank with cross strips nailed sideways to stop slippage, was still on the boat. Not that she required the ladder, because the craft was more tightly against the towpath, and the water level of the canal made it relatively easy to step in, as long as she held on to the side of the boat. Going down the steps into the cabin backwards seemed her safest option. She cursed herself for her size. At least the butty had more space, due to the lack of an engine, than Mallard. She heaved her bags down, looked about her, and sneezed. A white coating of dust had settled everywhere. Not enough for Tolly to want to clean immediately, but she sneezed again, then blew her nose. Cupboards and shelves lined the varnished walls of the small space, which was barely 5 foot high. Someone had used a sharp instrument to comb the varnish, so it looked wood-like. Mugs, jugs, and anything with a handle dangled from hooks that jutted from shelves. Heat was coming from a small stove with a flat top, and she stepped away from it. Of course, she thought. The stove doubled as a cooker, so even though the weather was warm, it had to be alight. Where was her bed? There should be space for 2, shouldn't there? She sat down on what appeared to be a long seat and pulled a knob that opened a cupboard to reveal tins of food and condensed milk. To the side there was another cupboard, empty this time, so she filled it with stuff from her bags. Then she spotted a hinged pull-down cupboard running alongside the opposite side of the cabin. Lifting the wooden plank, she saw she could erect a table by placing it along cutouts in the shelving. Pleased with herself, Tolly saw that if she fitted the plank into similar slots lower down, the table became a bunk, running diagonally across from the seat she was sitting on. Of course, she said to herself. She had been sitting on the second bed. Deciding it wasn't possible that her cabin mate could be larger than her, Tolly tumbled her sleeping bag into the space below the seat to nestle with a pillow and a folded blanket. She sneezed again, disturbing more of the powdery substance. Sitting there in the small space, she decided it was quite cosy. How would it feel containing another person as well as herself? Time would tell. "Tolly!" Dorothy's voice was loud and clear. Momentarily, Tolly had forgotten the other 2 women were eager to be off to collect the 4th member of their party. Tolly poked her head out of the hatch and yelled, "Coming!" Chapter 10. Elsie handed Tolly a mug of tea, and Dorothy started the diesel engine that powered Mallard. Then, with her hand on the tiller, she eased the 7-foot-wide narrowboat out of the basin and into the main canal. Bunting, tied closely to Mallard, bobbed behind. "Bunting has a tiller, but it's a little different from this one. All the time the boat is on the move, you must be in front of the tiller." Elsie saw Tolly stare at Dorothy. Her forehead creased. Dorothy had called her from Bunting onto Mallard, leaving the butty boat without anyone at the helm. "But we're only going a short distance," Dorothy said. "We're carrying no cargo, and I need to show you both how to use the tiller and the gear lever. Never do as I do as I tell you. Come here and take over, Tolly." Dorothy motioned towards a handle. "There are no brakes on a narrowboat, and it doesn't steer like a car." She pointed to an R on the lever. "Reverse," she explained. "Even if you put the boat's engine in reverse, momentum will keep it travelling forward, so you must be aware well in advance of any manoeuvre you need to make." Elsie saw Tolly nod, understanding Dorothy. "When our 4th worker is picked up," said Dorothy, "I expect the 2 of you to guide the engineless butty safely behind us. You'll show our new girl all you've learned. But you'll be surprised at how much you can gain from doing it yourself." Not allowing Tolly to remonstrate, Dorothy moved forward, and Tolly, her face white, grabbed the swan-necked tiller from her, standing in the position Dorothy had just vacated. "I can't stand beside you, there's no room. If you have to swing the tiller sideways, I could end up in the canal, or cut, as it's called. As you can see, there's very little room for us all to stand on the stern of the boat." Elsie could see Tolly was trying not to show how petrified she was. "Because this boat's engine pulls the butty boat, you'll soon see that the turn on the tiller causes the boat to move in a different direction. Take it easy. There's no need to go more than 4 miles an hour, because if you do, we'll be washing the sides of the canal away, causing the earth to fall into the water, and the cut's in a poor state as it is." Tolly took her eyes briefly from the front of the boat. Its position in the centre of the cut shifted sideways towards the bank. Elsie watched as hastily Tolly corrected its course. "Using the tiller should become automatic, not something you have to think about. The boat must become part of you.
Sometimes it helps you relax if you chat, instead of looking and feeling terrified. Did you put your stuff away? Dorothy asked. Yes, and when I get a chance, I might give the boat a good clean to get rid of the white dust I found everywhere. Oh, that's nothing to worry about, Dorothy smiled. It's Keating's powder, sprinkled lavishly to get rid of the fleas.
The sudden silence that followed caused Tolly to take her eyes from the boat's progress to gape at Dorothy. Suddenly they were heading towards the towpath.
"Tolly, the boat!"
Elsie cried. The bank loomed precariously close. Tolly stepped quickly forward and pulled the gear lever into reverse. The boat struggled against the command, but checked. Elsie breathed a sigh of relief as the water churned beneath the long vessel and its path was corrected.
"Well done!"
Dorothy was ecstatic in her praise.
"Excellent reflexes. I knew you'd soon get the hang of it."
Tolly put the motor switch into an upright position that signalled she was giving it no more commands, and the boat found its own impetus in the water. The butty boat bumped Mallard's rear bollards, but no damage was done. The plump white rope fenders hanging from both boats had softened the impact.
"Which is why a person needs to steer on a boat that has no engine."
Dorothy's face was wreathed in smiles.
"I knew I'd picked a good team," she said. "Fleas? What did you mean?"
Tolly shouted.
"In the warm weather, the boats often get an infestation of fleas, and they're absolute buggers to get rid of," answered Dorothy. "Keating's powder's the best there is."
Elsie could think of no words to explain how she felt about the possibility of the unwelcome passengers on the boat. Dorothy moved the motor into a forward position and said to Tolly,
"Get the boats back on course. Not far now before we pick up our fourth."
In a remarkably short while, both boats were sailing in a straight line up the middle of the canal, and the talk had turned back to fleas. Dorothy said to Elsie,
"You don't seem too shocked at the prospect of fleas."
"The last time I slept in an air raid shelter all night, I found I was covered in flea bites in the morning. Thank God for Keating's powder. I did notice it was dusted liberally in this boat as well. One of the hazards of living in a confined space where there's plenty of heat, I suppose." Dorothy nodded.
"Don't worry, you two. We managed to keep the pests at bay, mostly."
Elsie made a face at Tolly. Then she sat with her back to the water, allowing the early sun to warm her face. Soon they would be picking up the final member of their team. She hoped she'd take to her. She'd already warmed to the plump girl holding the tiller. She smiled at Dorothy, who had now pulled a shapeless knitted hat over her hair. The three of them looked as though they'd dressed from a ragbag, Elsie thought, all in mismatched but warm clothing. Dorothy had stressed that it could be cold on the cut early in the mornings, so keeping warm was a #1 priority.
"Is it true the water gypsies resent us being on the cut?"
Elsie couldn't help herself. She looked across at the vista before her. Fields and flowers and trees blended into the sunshine so beautifully that she didn't want anyone to harbour bad feelings.
"Why shouldn't they? I'll give you a few tips. Don't call them bargees. Don't be over-familiar with the menfolk. The women won't like it, and you'll not do yourselves any favours with the men, as they'll think you're easy. And always ask permission to board their boats, even when we've had to tie up alongside to get off the cut and onto the towpath."
Dorothy paused.
"You have to remember, we're the newcomers. They've lived all their lives, and in many cases their ancestors before them, on the waterways."
Tolly gasped.
"They live on these barges?" "Yes, and have brought up families here. The women take great pride in furnishing the cabins with brasses, china and lace. They're very proud people," Dorothy answered. "And they're boats, not barges," she admonished. "I never saw a tap or a sink," Tolly said.
Elsie realised she was referring to the cabin.
"You probably didn't notice the pail of fresh water," said Dorothy, "which must be refilled from water points along the way. Be sparing with the fresh water, and use water from the cut for cleaning, and before you ask, no, there's no lavatory on board. Use a different bucket for that and tip it over the side in the mornings."
Elsie saw Tolly wrinkle her nose. Dorothy had already chatted to her about life on board, so had also explained that there were several towns they would pass through where they could pay at the slipper baths for hot water to bathe. "There's a store of coal on Mallard that we refresh from points along the way," added Dorothy. "The stoves take wood and anything that'll burn. We often pick up logs and such in the countryside." God, thought Elsie, there was so much to learn, but it would be such hard work that she wouldn't have time to think about Gosport. She wondered about Tolly and why she'd joined the narrow boats. She looked forward to the girly chats they'd no doubt have when they got to know each other better. Dorothy was the deep one, the enigma, she thought. For although Dorothy seldom stopped talking, it was all about the work, not herself. Elsie looked towards her. She was keeping her eyes on Tolly with the tiller. "It won't be long before we pick up our new friend," Dorothy said. "I've already spoken to her about locks, but I think I'd better explain to you how they work. Because the land isn't flat, the canals need locks to allow the water to become a levelling point for the boats. Normal depth of a canal can be as little as 3 feet, and you'll notice how low the boats are when fully loaded. Narrow boats need to go up and down hills, and this is where the locks come in. We trap the boats in a lock, then let the water run in or out so the boat can be raised or lowered. Locks are easy to manoeuvre as long as you abide by the rules. We have windlasses or lock keys to open or shut the gates. These lock keys you must guard with your lives. Never leave one behind or let one fall into the canal. The canal folk usually tuck theirs into their leather belts." Dorothy lifted a wooden cover from a box-like contraption at the rear, near the tiller, and took out an L-shaped piece of metal. "All the canal mechanisms should have safety ratchets on them. You must slip the ratchet down. If you don't bother, the lock key can fly off and injure you." She held up the metal object. "This is a lock key or windlass. There are 4 on this boat, 1 for each of us." Dorothy thought she'd given Tolly and Elsie enough information to worry about, so after returning the windlass to its home, she perched on the stern rail and began to enjoy the sunshine that promised to become warmer as the day went on. It wouldn't be many minutes before the black cow came into sight. She hoped Elsie and Tolly would take to the new girl as easily as she had. 2 horses stood in a field, watching the boats pass, and the chugging of the engine was soothing her frustration at being unable to do the thing she most wanted to do. Like other people during this hateful war, Dorothy was having to make do with second best. She spied the lone figure sitting in the grass. "That's her, up ahead. When you get closer, pull in towards the towpath." Tolly began slowing the engine. As the figure rose to a standing position, Dorothy was surprised to see a smile light Elsie's face, and she began waving frantically. Tolly brought the narrowboat as close to the banks as she dared. Dorothy was so busy checking Tolly's movements that she almost missed the excited squeal Elsie gave before she jumped from the boat, landed in front of the girl, and threw her arms about her, almost knocking her off her feet.
"Why didn't you let my mum know you were following me?"
The new girl was jumping up and down with joy. "I thought you'd be on another boat and long gone," Elsie said.
"Dorothy hurt her foot, and I've been boarded out while the crew was formed."
The girl smiled at Dorothy. Then to Elsie she said,
"Oh, it's lovely to see you."
The 2 women hugged and laughed. Of course, Dorothy thought. Both came from Gosport. Both had worked in the munitions factory there, so it was likely they knew each other. End of CD 2. CD 3. "Had I known you were friends, I could have put you on the same boat," said Dorothy. "Never mind. I'm sure we'll all get on together fine." She began introductions. "Tolly, this is Izzy. Izzy, Tolly. And before we go any further, I trust you've all brought your gas masks?" Nods all round. Izzy unwound herself from Elsie's clutches.
"Elsie, I've got loads to tell you," she said. and I'm happy to start work. I'm on the butty, aren't I?"
"Correct," said Dorothy. She turned to Tolly.
"Now, I know how good a steerer you are. It's your job on Bunting to show Izzy what you know."
She gestured towards the second craft bobbing against the side of the canal.
"Izzy, get your stuff on board. We'll all chat later. Tolly, how do you feel about cooking breakfast? I lit the stove early this morning, and there's bread, plenty of groceries and water on board. Don't forget, everyone, to hand me your ration books for shopping. You won't need to pay me. It's only the coupons I'll need."
Elsie climbed back on board, and Dorothy watched as Tolly helped Izzy carry her bags to Bunting. She allowed them time to sort themselves out, and when Tolly and Izzy appeared from the cabin, their faces wreathed in smiles, she waved to let them know she was ready for the off again. As Elsie took the tiller, looking apprehensive, Dorothy engaged the engine for her and thought how brilliant it was that both girls had managed to keep secret that they knew each other until the last moment. The government was fond of its slogans proclaiming, "Be like Dad and keep Mum," and "Loose lips sink ships," and now she had in her care 2 women she hoped she could trust, perhaps even with her own secret if it leaked out. Chapter 11. "Isn't it a beautiful morning?" Elsie grinned at Dorothy.
"And what a lovely smell! Tolly's obviously got the hang of cooking on that small stove,"
said Dorothy. Elsie felt ridiculously happy, one hand on the tiller as she watched the front of the boat sailing midstream down the leafy channel of water. She realised she was at peace, probably for the first time since Geoffrey had dropped his bombshell about his affair and the baby. She and Izzy had a lot of catching up to do. She was looking forward to telling her all her news. A lot had happened in such a short while. Unless Izzy asked, she decided she wouldn't volunteer the information regarding Charlie's visit to her home. Izzy seemed happy. Let her stay that way.
"This work's not popular with the girls,"
said Dorothy, breaking into Elsie's thoughts.
"It hasn't the glamour of the services, and doesn't pay as well as the factories. But after your first trip, the money will rise by £1 a week."
"That's good," said Elsie. She took a deep breath of the cooking smell. "I'm really looking forward to breakfast."
"Narrowboat ahead,"
said Dorothy. As the boat approached, Elsie knew she must slow down. Her heart was beating fast. Did she pass on the left or the right? It was difficult to remember when she was so new to steering a 70-foot-long boat pulling another craft. She slowed, steered to allow the other boat to pass, and as the elderly fellow in cap, shirt-sleeves and a jaunty yellow waistcoat also slowed down, she remembered to hail him and thank him for his consideration. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Dorothy checking behind to make sure Bunting was giving the boat clearance.
"Good morning,"
Elsie cried. She was rewarded with a glare, an ugh, and a gobbet of spit that fell into the water as his boat passed.
"Did you see that?"
Elsie was shocked.
"Not everyone likes to see young women working the cart,"
Dorothy said.
"Take no notice. You behaved impeccably, and I certainly like the way you handled this boat, but you can speed up again now. We'll stop for breakfast before we reach the bridge and lock."
Then Elsie was startled to hear Dorothy sing, "Spit me good night, Sergeant Major." She changed the first word kiss of the well-known song. Elsie giggled, then joined in with Dorothy's lusty tones, their voices carrying on the still air. Singing was a wonderful tonic, Elsie thought. Eventually Dorothy paused.
"Laugh, and the world laughs with you. Cry, and you cry alone,"
finished Elsie. They laughed. How smashing it was to feel so happy, she thought. The throb of the engine and the faint whiff of diesel obviously agreed with her, but she thought it would be lovely to stop and enjoy a good breakfast in these wonderful surroundings. She didn't want to think about the bridge and the lock, though. Eventually, Dorothy supervised both boats mooring up. This time, metal spikes were driven into the earth and the boats tied close to the towpath to stop them drifting. Dorothy and Elsie were presented with breakfast carried from Bunting to Mallard. Scrambled eggs and a huge pile of pancakes adorned each plate. It smelt delicious, and Elsie licked her lips. "I hope you like pancakes. I know we normally only have them on Shrove Tuesday, but I took a chance," said Tolly, producing salt and pepper from her trouser pockets after she'd handed Dorothy her plateful. "There's jam to go on them, if you want. Sorry the egg is powdered, but I hope you'll like it. I thought at first I'd not be able to cook on that stove, but it's easy once you get the hang of it." "Yum, yum. I've never had pancakes for breakfast," said Dorothy. "What made you decide to cook them?" Tolly said, "I saw the flour and the egg powder and thought, why not?" Elsie couldn't say a word, for her mouth was full of pancake. Eventually she found her voice. "I wish you'd always cook for us." "I wouldn't mind," said Tolly. "I can make a delicious bacon and egg tart, and there's plenty of dried egg powder left." "Sadly, we have to take our turns at all the tasks ahead of us," said Dorothy. "But I'll happily allow you to carry on doing more of the work you decide you like most." "Isn't this heaven?" Izzy turned her face to the sun. Elsie thought she looked so much more relaxed than when last she'd seen her that night in the Fox. After their plates had been wiped clean, with chunks of bread certainly seeming more tasty than the grey loaves Elsie had been buying in Gosport, Dorothy allowed them to chat and get to know each other until it was time to go. Elsie and Izzy had taken a walk along the towpath. "Oh, I have missed you," Izzy said. "Well, it's lovely we're together now," Elsie answered. "It would have been even better to share the butty with you." "How is it with Tolly?" "She's a good sort," said Izzy. "Quiet at first. Now won't shut up about what she'd do if she owned that cafe she worked in. But I really like her." "That's just as well, as you'll be sharing with her for a few weeks. I like Dorothy." Izzy nodded. "I'm so glad you decided to come on the narrowboats." "Getting away from Charlie's done wonders for you," Elsie said, stopping and staring at Izzy. "You look so rested and happy." "I think this experience is going to be the making of both of us," Izzy said, giving her a big grin. Their conversation was cut short by a shout from Dorothy. "I think that means we're wanted back on board," said Elsie, turning and waving at the others. Arm in arm they walked towards the moored boats. As Elsie neared Mallard, she heard Dorothy and Tolly talking about chores. "I vote that whoever cooks a meal also washes up," said Tolly. "That way the cook'll make sure there are fewer used plates and pans." "Good idea," chorused Elsie and Izzy as they stepped on board. "That seems a good solution, unless anyone feels like helping washing up the dishes," said Dorothy. "Unanimous vote?" Everyone shouted yes. Tolly and Izzy began collecting up the dirty crockery. "You'll be all right if I go below and get on with some paperwork, won't you?" Elsie nodded, trying to look more confident than she felt about handling the narrowboat alone. "Won't you find it too dark in the cabin?" She hoped Dorothy might suggest she'd prefer to sit up top and work. At least then she'd be able to keep an eye on her. "Papers fly away in the breeze," answered Dorothy. "Give us a call when the lock's in sight. There's a bridge ahead, but as long as you keep to the middle of the cut and remember to slow down as you pass beneath, you'll be fine." Sure enough, Elsie passed through the ivy-covered red brick bridge with inches to spare on each side of the boat. She even managed to turn to Tolly and Izzy, giving them a warning wave. So far, there had been little traffic on the water, but the nearer they got to London, the more there would be. Elsie wondered what Oxford would be like. Dorothy had explained that they would stay overnight in Oxford, then go down part of the Thames to Limehouse, where they would pick up materials that they would then drop off at Birmingham via the Grand Union Canal. There, they would be loaded with coal that would be unloaded, possibly at Coventry, and perhaps pick up another cargo to discharge at Banbury or thereabouts on the Oxford Canal. From there, it was a short distance to Lower Hayford, where they'd clean the boats and refuel, then start all over again, this time with different orders to fulfill. Dorothy said they'd be more than ready after that to go home to their families for a few days. As far as Elsie could guess, Izzy would prefer not to return to Gosport, where no doubt Charlie Osborne would find her. She thought she might suggest Izzy accompany her to Weston Way. She doubted the house would have been sold in that short time. It was unlikely that Geoffrey would discover a buyer so quickly. Tolly would be going home to Titchfield, which was not far from Gosport. Dorothy had already told her she intended visiting her mother in Southampton before she returned to the cottage she rented from Rousham Cruisers in Lower Hayford. Elsie had left her car in the boatyard, and one of the staff had thrown a tarpaulin over it to stop the birds messing on it. Elsie rarely used her car, preferring at home to ride her bicycle, but she would offer to drive them all south to save them paying for train tickets, as there was still plenty of petrol in the car's tank. So deep in thought was Elsie that the lock was suddenly ahead of her, looming like a castle to be conquered. She slowed the engine. Dorothy poked her head out of the cabin and shouted back to Bunting, "Lock ahead!" To Elsie she said, "Move in towards the bank so you can get off the boat. I'll take the tiller." Panic took over. Was she supposed to open those huge black wooden lock gates by herself? What had Dorothy said about pushing or pulling the balance beams, the long square wooden arms? Lock key? She'd need one from the box. Despite the roiling of her stomach, she couldn't help but notice a very pretty cottage within a white-painted fence and a path leading to the open front door. Tea roses, creamy and full, were growing practically as high as the diamond-paned windows below the thatched roof. Looking at the house was a small distraction until panic consumed her. Could she remember all that Dorothy had told her about locks? As she looked now at the huge wooden gates, she couldn't be at all sure. Tolly had already jumped from Bunting and was moving quickly, puffing and panting across a small, high iron bridge to the other side of the lock. "The gates won't open themselves?" Startled by Dorothy's voice, Elsie stepped from the boat, after making sure the vessel's rope was loosely hooked around a nearby bollard. The boat needed to be raised to the next water level. Windlass in hand, she followed Tolly's example and ran to the lock gates. The lock was empty, so the boats needed to enter. Water had to flood inside the chamber so the boats could rise to the level of the water on the other side of the lock. Well, Elsie thought, that much she'd worked out. So now the gates had to be opened to allow the boats to move in. She pushed against the balance beam, saw that Tolly was doing the same on the other side, and put her lock key on top of the beam. With her full weight against the wood, she was happy to see and feel it move. And move it did until it came to a juddering stop, and she looked in horror as her lock key jumped into the air, fell into the water and disappeared. "Why the hell didn't you call for the lockkeeper if you've no idea what you're doing?" Elsie whirled around and found herself face to chest with a tall man who, she saw, as her eyes travelled upwards, had hair the colour of tow rope and eyes as blue as the sky, encased in dark-rimmed spectacles. He was frowning at her. "You shouldn't be let loose on the cut," he bellowed so loudly she felt his warm breath on her face. Elsie's knees buckled at the shock, and she staggered backwards. He grabbed hold of her before she fell into the lock, pulling her forward and against him. Momentarily, she was caught in his arms. It was like nothing she'd experienced before, that feeling of being cocooned. "Oh, God," she thought, as her stomach knotted and her breath became strangled. Heat ran through her like molten metal. For a moment, he was motionless. A peculiar look had entered his eyes. It shook Elsie to her core. With great difficulty, she pushed him away. There was a need there. Unspoken, not that Elsie was going to admit it. That look was something so rare and unexpected that it had taken her only a moment to recognise he yearned for her, body and soul. He stared at her, the moment of eye contact seeming unending, then said grudgingly, "I'll give you my windlass. You can return it when you're back this way." "What makes you think I'll come here again?" She sounded as though her mouth was full of treacle. Her mind was still on the unexplained look in his eyes. Perhaps she should feel outraged at his audacity, But she didn't. Not at all. Suddenly he smiled at her. "You're from the boatyard at Lower Hayford. You'll be back. Maybe by then I'll have fished your lock key from the water." He put a finger to the bridge of his nose and pushed his spectacles higher. Elsie, pulling herself together, allowed her eyes to dwell on his tan skin. He wore corduroy trousers and a grey waistcoat open over a white shirt. She noticed as he moved he had a slight limp. It didn't seem to affect his quick skill at unwinding the rack and pinion. Elsie looked across the lock at Tolly, who was now attempting a similar job on the other side. Elsie wondered if she'd seen her clutched in the man's arms. Both boats were now nestled side by side in the empty lock, with Izzy at the tiller of Bunting and Dorothy in charge of Mallard. Dorothy was staring up at her, a bemused look on her face. Obviously she had witnessed everything. "Now we close the gates, allow the water in, and the boats will rise to the next level," he said. "Then we open the gates and off you go." The anger had left his voice. Elsie knew instantly that whatever she had felt just now, he had experienced it too. She looked back towards the cottage, and suddenly it came to her. "Are you the lock-keeper?" He nodded. "And this one's a deep lock. I'm here to help, and you're supposed to wait for me if you're unsure of the procedure." "I didn't know." Her excuse sounded feeble. She knew she was blushing. She had no idea what to say to him. This man who had unleashed something inside her with no warning. "Well, you do now. Your mate," he inclined his head towards Tolly, "seems to know what she's doing." The water level floating the two boats was now almost equal to the depth of water outside the lock. He began winding down the rack and pinion, making sure the ratchet was on safety, then put his windlass on the grass. "Leave the gates to me and your mate. You'd better get back on the boat. It's a long walk to the next lock." He smiled, showing even white teeth. "I'll finish up here." For some obscure reason, Elsie didn't want to leave him. Together they pushed against the balance arm, opening the lock gate. Tolly was making her way to the side of the bank, ready to board Bunting as it came out of the lock. Elsie knew she ought to get back on board. Reluctantly, she turned from him. "Don't forget the windlass." He bent, picked up the lock key and handed it to her. Again she noticed his slight awkwardness when he bent his knee. Her tongue felt too large for her mouth as she managed "thank you" and dazedly walked away. A sadness settled over her, but was immediately dispelled when he yelled, "I don't know your name."
"Elsie,"
she called back. "Jack," he shouted and grinned. For the first time she noticed a small white dog at his heels. She liked dogs. She couldn't wait to tell Izzy about all the feelings the man had unleashed in her. As Elsie climbed aboard Mallard, Dorothy said, "Well, that's a turn-up for the books. I thought I was going to have to tell you off for losing a precious windlass. Instead, you've charmed the lock-keeper." Chapter 12. "I'm happy with the progress we've made so far," Dorothy said. The smell of cooking hung in the air as they huddled in Mallard's cabin. They'd eaten a simple evening meal that, again, Tolly had prepared. Potatoes, carrots, and a tin of corned beef with gravy. "I don't know how you manage it, but even this humble meal tastes special," she added. Tolly beamed with pleasure. "Wait till you try my Walton pie," she said.
"Wasn't that created by a chef at the Savoy Hotel in London?"
asked Izzy. "It was," said Tolly, "and the woman who taught me to bake worked there."
"Well, I can't wait,"
said Izzy. The light was boosted by candles provided by Elsie, despite Dorothy's warnings that she should save them, as they weren't easy to get hold of. All the tiny windows had been covered, as blackout restrictions were still in force. Dorothy said, "I see you made a friend of Jack Lumley." She raised her eyebrows. "Quite a feat, as he doesn't like us girls on the cut. Thinks we're more trouble than we're worth." Tolly giggled. "He didn't think she was bothersome. I wish it was me he'd held in his arms."
"Bit of all right, if you ask me,"
added Izzy, pushing a hand through her red curls. Elsie put her plate on the floor.
He seems nice. Well, he gave me his windlass after mine fell in the lock. He's not normally so kind, Dorothy said. Usually, any of my girls who put a foot out of line get the sharp end of Jack's tongue. He's taken a fancy to you.
Elsie spluttered into her tea.
But I'm a married woman.
She waved her left hand with the telltale wedding ring. Tolly and Izzy laughed.
I don't suppose he noticed that, Izzy said. Anyway, being nice to you doesn't mean anything more than, well, that he was being kind. But it was a rather particular look. He's taciturn at the best of times, Dorothy began.
Why isn't he in the forces? Elsie interrupted.
He was. Air Force, shot down and lost part of his leg.
Dorothy didn't usually gossip, but Elsie had asked.
He prefers a solitary life. He's lived in that cottage, working as a lock-keeper for a couple of years now. Got quite a reputation for being grumpy.
Dorothy was aware that Elsie's husband had strayed, and she had left her hometown so she could think about the future. Elsie was far too sensible to be swept off her feet by another man so soon, wasn't she? She couldn't help herself. Dorothy yawned. Pretty soon Tolly was complaining that she was sleepy too.
You're not used to being out in the fresh air, and I'm so tired I could sleep on a line, Dorothy said.
Nevertheless, the women sat and chatted until Dorothy advised Izzy and Tolly to return to Bunting.
An early start tomorrow,
she said, as she began clearing the plates and picking up the empty cups.
I'll leave you to get ready for bed, Elsie. Give you a little privacy while I help Tolly and Izzy take these dishes back to the other boat. Don't worry about the Keating's powder. It'll do more good than harm.
She knew how difficult it could be, undressing and washing in a confined space with a virtual stranger present. She also knew the shyness would soon wear off. It always did. On Bunting, Dorothy chatted amiably with Tolly and Izzy and dried a few pots as the girls washed up. The sky was clouding over as she walked back to Mallard. She was glad the two in Bunting seemed to be easy in each other's company. Elsie was in bed when Dorothy pushed open the door and entered the snug cabin. All she could see of her was the top of her head peeping up from the sleeping bag. The dry smell of the Keating's powder hung in the air. Tomorrow, hopefully, they could dust it away.
Are you warm enough?
Dorothy asked.
Luckily the stove keeps the temperature up.
A grunt came from Elsie's bunk. She poured water from the bucket into a bowl, then undressed. Quickly she scrubbed her face and neck, cleaned her teeth, and put on a pair of flannelette pyjamas. Then she climbed the steps, opened the door, and threw the used water over the side of the boat. Within moments she'd bolted the cabin door and was in her own bunk. She had no idea how long she'd been asleep, but she was woken by Elsie leaning over and shaking her.
Shouldn't we find an air raid shelter? Don't worry, they're ours.
Dorothy spoke sleepily, but her voice was drowned by the heavy growl of planes overhead. The deafening roar took her words away, like leaves in the wind. She extracted a hand from the warmth of her sleeping bag and laid it on Elsie's shoulder. The rumble of aircraft seemed to have fled into the distance. Dorothy sat up. She could see Elsie was scared.
Upper Haford's RAF station for Bomber Command is close by. The Wellingtons fly from the training unit on night manoeuvres. If it had been a raid, you'd have heard moaning Minnie, same as back in Gosport.
She saw relief spread across Elsie's face.
I'm sorry. I'm so used to the boys' night flying, I forgot to warn you all. Actually, this is where your lockkeeper trained.
Elsie said crossly,
He's not my lockkeeper.
Dorothy smiled to herself.
I ought to go and warn the other two. I don't want them frightened out of their wits.
Elsie, calmer now, said, I think they'd have been knocking on this boat by now if they were worried. I'm getting back into bed. It seems to have quietened down now out there. Besides, it's raining. Dorothy's head fell back on her feather pillow. The rain reminded her of needles being thrown against a window.
Night.
The small voice came from Elsie. Dorothy mumbled back to her. She hoped the girls had all brought sensible footwear and clothing to keep out the rain. She feared it would last all of tomorrow. Elsie lay warm and still. She didn't want to disturb Dorothy again, especially now her fears about the bombers had been dealt with. She could hear the even breathing that signalled Dorothy was asleep again. She thought of Geoffrey, and how they'd longed for a child. Now he dashed any hope of her becoming a mother. She willed herself not to cry, not to make a sound. The thought of becoming a childless, wrinkled spinster wasn't something Elsie looked forward to. Never had she envisaged her marriage becoming so shaky that Geoffrey would look elsewhere, but he had. She thought of the feelings that had coursed through her body that afternoon. She'd known immediately her eyes had held Jack's that he had felt it too. The sudden look of bewilderment on his face before he'd taken her in his arms had confirmed it. And he'd been so eager to know her name. The whole scenario was very puzzling. Elsie knew she would soon be asking a lot of questions about Jack Lumley. Tolly was happy with her sleeping bag covering her. She'd opened it out flat, deciding she didn't want to be confined within its limited space. She hoped with all her heart that Izzy was soundly asleep and comfortable on the smaller bunk. She didn't know when she had last enjoyed a day as much as she had today. Out in the sunshine, in the fresh air, then showing off her cooking prowess to her new friends. At least, she hoped they looked upon her as a friend. She tried so hard not to get in the way when the many boating jobs had had to be carried out. Already she had so much to write and tell Reggie. Her body felt ridiculously tired. She suspected the extra exercise had made her use muscles she'd never known she had. Several times Dorothy had sent her on ahead, walking along the towpath to set the locks, so they could go straight into the chambers. If other boats were already lined up, she'd had to wait her turn until they'd passed through, then reset the locks. It had been hard work, harder than making tea and serving customers. Her arms felt now as if they were falling off. She wasn't stupid, though. As it had been only their first day together, no one had really talked about themselves, but she was sure there was more to her three companions than they were letting on. Elsie and Izzy obviously knew each other and were firm friends. She gathered they'd worked together at the munitions factory in Gosport. What had happened to make them leave their hometown? In Izzy, Tolly could sense fear. It showed in the way she constantly looked about her as though she expected to find something or someone she didn't want to see. Elsie wore a wedding ring. Had her husband died? Been killed? And that look from the lock-keeper. Oh, how Tolly wished she could inspire a man to look at her like that. Dorothy was the strangest of the three. For all her authority, there was vulnerability. No, Dorothy might pretend to be the strongest. After all, she was their boss and knew the job and the canals in a way they never could. But Tolly believed she was hiding a sorrow far greater than any of them could possibly imagine. Chapter 13. Jack Lumley pushed away his cocoa mug and sighed. What on earth had happened today? A woman he'd never before set eyes on had thrown him into turmoil. "Move over, matey," he said companionably to the white Jack Russell curled up at his side, trying for the lion's share of the armchair. The dog opened one eye, and Jack lovingly scratched the rough hair behind its ears. Elsie had felt it too, whatever it had been that had coursed through him with such power and sent him reeling. Oxford would be the first real stop on the canal boat girls' journey to Limehouse. It usually was. They needed to be able to walk on pavements, see shops and buy a few bits and pieces, if they could, in war-torn England, to keep up their morale after they'd been on the alien territory of the Cut. There wasn't much that went on in the village or on the canals that he wasn't privy to. A sharp twinge in his leg made him grit his teeth. He was due a hospital appointment in Oxford very soon. Sensing his discomfort, Matey stared at him with large, moist eyes. "I'll get someone to look after you for a couple of days. You'll not be left on your own." He remembered the little dog cowering against the hedge, trying to shield himself from the stones thrown at him by several village boys. Jack had brought the frightened, snarling and bloodied animal into his home after he chased the lads away. He'd inserted a notice in the post office window saying he had the dog, but no one claimed him. A good thing, too, for now, a year later, Jack and Matey were inseparable. Jack smiled at the little dog, then gazed around the home he had made for himself. A low fire burned, warming the comfortable room. A letter on the mantelpiece from the Inland Waterways, his employer, was tucked behind the clock and needed no reply. The hospital appointment, ditto. Books lined a shelf running along the top of all four walls, just below ceiling height. Books were his friends. "Damn leg," grumbled Jack. The dog licked his hand sympathetically. "Suppose she finds she can't cope with life on the cut and Oxford is the end of the line for her." If he expected a reply from his canine friend, he didn't get it. He'd noticed the wedding ring on her left hand. "Means very little nowadays, Matey," he said. "If she had a loving partner, I doubt she'd be working for Dorothy and the Canal Company." Unless, he thought, the man was abroad, and likely to be so for the unforeseeable future. If that was the case, he'd not force himself between them. He'd bow out gracefully. But he had been able to tell that Elsie, although shocked, had felt the same as he had. "A woman in a loving marriage would have slapped my face for holding her like that," he said to Matey. The dog's tongue lolled in agreement. A further twinge caused him to rub the ankle he no longer had. He coped with the prosthetic limb well. The Dutch surgeon had done a fine job. Outside, rain flung itself against the windows. His thoughts went back to that cold, overcast February night in 1942, when he had been returning in the Wellington from a successful mission. He believed he was on course, but he was unable to see clearly for the ice on the perspex. The ferocity of the freezing weather had caused the iced-up port engine to stall. Then part of the propeller had broken off, forcing itself through the side of the aircraft. Fear had filled the plane, but the men's cries were tempered by the wind and extreme cold. With the hydraulics damaged, they'd come down in the freezing sea. He had managed to pull himself onto the floating carcass of the plane and alongside the damaged controls. The water had flushed him away so fiercely that he had no recollection of why part of his foot was missing. When he saw he was struggling for safety with one booted foot and a leg that ended in shredded trousers at the ankle, it surprised him that there was so little pain. The blood streaming from him made him realise he stood little chance of survival unless he could stem the flow quickly. The answer to that had been the ripped sleeve of his shirt tied as a tourniquet. Then he had lost consciousness. He knew he was not the only survivor when, retching up the seawater he'd swallowed, he was pulled into a dinghy that already contained 3 men. Although they'd stayed near the scene, using their hands as paddles while they continued to search, no more of the 7-man crew were found. Flight Lieutenant Danson had suffered a chest wound but was conscious. William Devereux was in shock. Edward Luston was quiet, and quieter still when it was discovered he had died, slipping away silently. Hypothermia was a killer. Shivering and wet, apart from Luston, they had survived the first night. Jack was determined to keep everyone from falling asleep. There were no oars, so the dinghy drifted. No water, except the sea around them. Devereux rallied briefly. On the second morning, he told them about his first day at infant school, then slipped into unconsciousness and simply drifted away. Jack shook him, but he had gone peacefully. The water was as flat as a mill pond, but Jack could hear seabirds. His body felt as though it no longer belonged to him. He was too cold to feel pain. "You've done your best, Jack," said Danson. Jack thought he was dreaming when a Netherlands fishing boat hauled them aboard. They left the bodies in the dinghy to be towed behind. The Dutch resistance brought them safely home, but not until 1943, because the Germans were heavily defending the coastline and covering Dutch airspace with their radar. Jack still woke crying for his crew. Since then, living beside the canal had suited him. His parents had died in a London bomb blast, and his wife had written to him to say that she couldn't cope with an invalid and intended to live alone in London. He doubted she would stay alone long. It wasn't in her nature. All he'd needed was complete peace and quiet. Lower Hayford suited him and Matey fine. Until today. That woman had made him feel he wanted to live again. Never before had he given in to an impulse, so he couldn't think of another word to fit his actions except impulsively. "Maybe she'll despise me for what I'm about to do, Matey. After all, it's completely alien to me. But if it means seeing Elsie again, if only for a moment, it's a chance I have to take." "Move over," he said, standing up and going towards the telephone. "I'm going to reserve a hotel room in Oxford, and this time I'll take a walk along the canal." Elsie opened her eyes to the sound of Dorothy breathing steadily, despite the noise of the rain on the wood and canvas roof of the narrowboat. For a moment she lay thinking of the lock-keeper and the dreams of him that had haunted her sleep. She wished she was sharing a boat with Izzy instead of Dorothy. It would be so easy to voice her thoughts to her friend. Elsie crawled from her bunk in her flannelette pyjamas and put fresh kindling, then some small pieces of coal on the still glowing embers in the stove. She soon had a kettle of water heating for tea. By the time Dorothy was awake, Elsie had cleaned her teeth and was wearing the clothes she'd taken off last night. She raked through her hair with a comb and decided there was little point in applying any makeup, as the teeming rain would spoil any effort she made to look nice. "How did you sleep?" "Surprisingly well," answered Elsie. She handed Dorothy a mug of tea. "And I've examined myself for flea bites and found none, so I'll not be too hasty in dusting away that powder." Dorothy smiled. Elsie pulled back the small covering from the round window. "It's getting light out there." She remembered that Dorothy had told her the boats tied up when darkness fell. The boat's headlight was used only in a tunnel. Everyone on the cut observed the blackout. Pity it's such a filthy day. She thought about the previous evening and how the four of them had sat out in the fresh air. It had been decided that Izzy would cook today, but Elsie couldn't see them eating breakfast outside. Dorothy was pulling on her clothes, and Elsie was pushing bedding into the recess when they heard frantic voices, then thumps on the locked door of the boat. "Come on, let us in! We're getting cold and wet!" Dorothy unlocked the cabin's door, and the two girls from Bunting almost fell down the steps, bringing with them rivulets of rain that pooled on the floor and a covered tray. "Take this!" Izzy pushed the piled tray at Elsie and shrugged herself out of an enormous oilskin that she left to lie on the floor at the bottom of the steps, dripping and steaming in the heat. Tolly thrust a surprisingly dry bag at Dorothy from beneath her coat and said, "Move up, we've brought breakfast, that's bread in there." Elsie set down the tray and helped Tolly off with her coat, which now also lay beside the steps, water running into the coir mat. "We must eat it while it's hot," Tolly added. "Everyone find somewhere to sit." No one needed second bidding, and within moments the four women were sitting around the stove, each with a breakfast of scrambled dried egg, beans, and fried bread. Dorothy was smiling at her charges while the cabin steamed with the wet clothing. Tolly was the first to break the contented atmosphere. "I brought a pack of cards so we don't get despondent with nothing to do until this downpour stops." Dorothy almost choked. "Sorry, girls," she said.
But the schedule doesn't make allowances for the weather. We have to be at Limehouse on the due date. It's my fault we've not already picked up a cargo." She glanced down at her ankle. "And, like the other workers on the cut, we ignore the rain." As if to reinforce her words, a particularly heavy gust sent raindrops clattering against the roof. "Our next official stop is near Oxford. You two," she nodded at Tolly and Izzy, "have already proved this rain doesn't stop you supplying breakfast, so it won't stop us getting to our destination on time. We're going to move off shortly." She gazed at each of them in turn, then looked at the kettle on the stove. "But not before I've made us all a good, strong cup of tea." Chapter 14. Elsie had never felt so tired in her life. She'd tumbled into bed after tearing off her damp clothes, which she'd spread, along with Dorothy's, over every available space to dry out in the warmth from the stove. The stale aroma of fish and chips in vinegar-soaked newspaper added to the smell of damp clothing. "What happened to your crew before us?" she asked. Even her bedding felt damp. "They left. Why? Because they couldn't handle the hardship. From what I've experienced today, my job in the munitions factory was child's play." Elsie was thinking that working on the narrowboats hadn't been a good idea after all. She propped herself up on one elbow and watched Dorothy brushing her long hair. "You look younger with your hair down," she said. Dorothy smiled. "Someone else used to say that." There was a faraway look in her eyes. "Tell me about him," urged Elsie. Perhaps he was the writer of the letter Dorothy had tucked beneath her pillow. She didn't like to pry. "What makes you think it was a man?" "Because there's always a man," said Elsie. "Do you think he'll like working on the boats?" Dorothy hadn't answered the question, clearly not wanting to carry on with that particular conversation. "Don't know. I'll give it a fair try." "Well, you can't be more honest than that," said Dorothy. "It looks like I've got a good crew this time." She crawled into her sleeping bag. "Damp gets everywhere," she added. Elsie was too tired to read either of her novels. Dorothy had turned down the oil lamp, but the glow from the stove gave plenty of light. She looked at her slacks, steaming above the coal bucket. No one cared how they dressed on the cut. Today had been all about keeping dry until it had become pointless to worry about being wet through. They'd travelled through 9 locks and countless lift bridges, and she'd had enough excitement for one day. She was so looking forward to Oxford, where they would be able to bathe and wash their hair at the public baths. Until then, as long as she cleaned her teeth regularly, Elsie didn't care how she looked. She'd learned a great deal about the boats. Today, the battery had died. It had had to be dragged out and a charged one installed in its place. It had also been her job to grease the couplings, the devices used to join the engine parts, which meant the cover in the cabin's floorboards had to be removed, the shaft checked for loose nuts and bolts, and re-greased with stuff that looked like thick margarine. She'd done that after clearing out the mud box and the bilge pumps. Water was filtered from the canal to cool the engine, and the muck that came in with it had to be cleared by hand and thrown back into the canal. Then, of course, there were the daily housekeeping chores, keeping the fires going, making sure the water and coal buckets were topped up, and today, because of the rain, the everlasting wringing out of mops used to swab the wet floors. She wondered how whole families managed to live on the boats and keep themselves and the craft shining with cleanliness. A smile touched the corners of her mouth. While waiting to enter a lock with a gypsy boat ahead of them, Elsie hadn't been able to stop herself peering in through its open door. Her eyes had widened at the cosy scene before her. She'd even spotted a baby asleep in a rush cot, the quilt white and lovingly embroidered. The wife was helping her man open the lock, and Elsie had ceased spying before she was discovered. Today, Izzy had fallen into the cut.
She'd hopped off at a bridge to run along the towpath to prepare the lock, but when she'd jumped back on the boat in the rain, her foot had slipped on the wet surface and she'd gone down and under. At first, Elsie had feared she might be dragged beneath Mallard, but Tolly had hauled her out of the muddy water, and Izzy had been more frightened than hurt. It had taken mugs of cocoa and a plate of corned beef sandwiches all round before Izzy was back to normal, wearing borrowed dry clothes, her own rinsed in the canal. The rain had finally exhausted itself by 7 that evening, when Dorothy had suggested tying up for the night alongside several other boats moored near a pub. "There's a pathway through a field that leads into a village, and I vote we walk in and buy fish and chips for tea," she'd said. Fish wasn't on the ration, thank goodness. "Suppose anyone sees me looking like this," wailed Tolly. "Well, it won't be anyone you know, will it?" Izzy said. After they'd roped the boats to the iron rings in the side of the concrete footpath, they set off. To reach the field, they'd had to trek through the gardens of the Jolly Boatmen. Wooden tables and stools were positioned outside for those who preferred not to enter the pub. They were used mostly by canal folk. The women were seldom to be found inside licensed premises, that domain belonging to the men. A couple of dogs chased each other around on the grass. A thin sun had broken through to end the day and warmed them, making the trek to the village more enjoyable and less wet than Elsie had envisaged. Elsie remembered the seductive smell of the fish and chips wrapped in newspaper she'd clutched as she walked back through the Jolly Boatman's garden. "Why don't we have a drink and eat here?" Izzy had suggested. "Good idea, but it means one of us has to go inside to buy drinks," Elsie had said. She glanced around the gardens and her eyes had fallen on an apple tree. "Wouldn't mind one of those for afters," she said. Dorothy had scolded her. "I'm not coming to haul you out of the local nick for scrumping." "I'll go," said Izzy. "I went in the Fox on my own, when I could." "That's settled, then." Dorothy handed over a 10-shilling note. Izzy left her parcel of food on a table and trotted off towards the open door. Elsie could hear her muttering their orders to herself so she wouldn't forget them. The girls had decided they wouldn't start eating without her. Moments later, she came out of the doorway, staggering under the weight of a large metal tray containing their glasses. Smiling at the gypsies in the garden, Izzy received glares in return. But Elsie could see her natural ebullience was not to be repressed. "This is a lovely end to a horrible wet day," Izzy said, attacking her newspaper bundle with enthusiasm. Elsie sat back, enjoying the last of the sun on her face. The battered fish had been beautifully cooked, as Dorothy had promised it would be. She was washing it down with her half-pint of shandy. Idly, she picked at the rest of her chips as she looked over the newspaper they'd been wrapped in. Isolated on the canal, they'd had no access to news from the outside world. She was enjoying sitting there, listening to her new friends chat while she turned the greasy pages of the Daily Mirror. She read of the mass evacuation of London, as V1s were targeted towards the city, and sighed. So many people had been killed by these awful bombs. Cartoon Jane was up to her usual misadventures, wearing scanty clothing. Elsie looked at the newspaper's date. It was a couple of days old. The paper shortage meant the news was presented to the public on fewer sheets of much lower quality than before the war. She smoothed the fat-soaked, smelly pages and read on. Her hand tightened on the crumpled paper. Long-firm fraud investigation. A Gosport man, Charles Edward Osborne of Queen's Road, who has been helping police with their inquiries into long-firm fraud, has been arrested. Hampshire detectives have uncovered what appears to be a full-scale fraudulent commercial enterprise, which involved setting up a bogus company, profiting from selling on goods, then disappearing, leaving suppliers unpaid. The World's Clothing Stores, the Electric Shop and Bunson's Fine Foods, all in the High Street, have been targeted, as well as 2 Lee-on-the-Solent furniture shops. Police have issued a statement asking shopkeepers and companies to be vigilant.
A Gosport police spokesman said, "The austerity of the war years make this a particularly heinous crime."
Unfortunately, that was where the article ended. Elsie could hardly believe what she was reading. She pushed the paper towards Izzy.
"You ought to read that."
She put a finger on the article and noted that Tolly and Dorothy were watching them.
Oh, my God!
Izzy exclaimed, as she pushed away the crumpled paper only for Dorothy to grab it. It was clear she had connected Charlie's name and Gosport with Izzy, especially as Izzy's face was the colour of chalk.
"You don't know anything about this, do you?"
Elsie said. One look at Izzy's distraught features gave her the answer.
"I'm sorry, of course you don't."
Izzy's eyes filled with tears. Dorothy passed the newspaper to Tolly and pointed to the piece.
"Who is this man?"
Dorothy asked Izzy hesitantly. It was as if a tap had been turned on. Izzy's words flowed like water as she explained her relationship with Charlie and how she'd finally found, with the help of her mother and Elsie, the courage to escape from his clutches. Elsie saw the dropped jaws and the horrified faces of her new friends. Then the pity, which was the last thing Izzy needed.
"Izzy did a brave thing in running away from him," she said.
Izzy wiped a hand across her face. The print and grease from the newspaper mixed with her tears to make dirty smudges on her skin.
"I've been on edge all the time, in case he should come after me," she said. "I never told you about Charlie knocking me about, Dorothy, because I wanted an entirely fresh start. I thought if you knew what a coward I was in not leaving him before, you might not take me on."
Elsie decided now was the time to tell her that Charlie had been searching for her.
"I didn't want to worry you, but he came to my house."
That was as far as Elsie got. Izzy grasped her arm.
"You didn't—"
"No. I gave you my word, and nothing would make me break it."
Izzy crossed her arms on the table and rested her head on them, her shoulders heaving. Dorothy said,
"He won't find you here. That's supposing he ever gets away from Gosport and comes looking. From that article," she laid her hand on the crumpled newspaper, "it seems unlikely he'll be going anywhere soon. I'm amazed the nasty piece of work managed to fill a warehouse with goods when everything, clothing, food, furniture, is so hard to come by. I wouldn't have censured you because of your background. It's now that matters."
She looked at each of them in turn.
"We've all got secrets and stories in our past that we don't want to reveal. Inland waterways check to make sure I'm not employing spies or felons, but your personal lives belong to you."
A silence followed. Then Izzy said,
"That's fair enough. I didn't know that. Charlie has friends who can get anything, and a great deal of his stolen gear comes from the American-based stores at Southampton."
"Well, I certainly wouldn't like to be in his shoes at present," Dorothy said. "Don't worry about him coming looking for you. Unless there's insufficient evidence, the newspapers don't usually name a person who isn't as guilty as hell. He could be locked up for a long time."
Elsie, whose arm was around Izzy's shoulders, whispered,
"You've got us now. You're safe here. You do know that, don't you?"
Izzy looked up.
"Yes,"
she said.
"I was making believe everything was all right and feeling better, but inside it was eating away at me."
There was a silence for a while. Then Izzy said,
"Look who's turned up."
Elsie turned to see a tall man pushing a bath chair across the grass towards a table and benches occupied by boat people. Amazingly, Izzy wasn't referring to the good-looking man propelling the elderly gentleman.
"I've got his book. That's Stefan, or Steve-O as he's known," she said. "I was reading The Man in the Iron Mask to him in the gardens at the Black Cow. The book's on the boat. I should return it to him, but I don't think I could bear to go across and chat to him at present after reading about Charlie."
"Of course not," broke in Tolly. "There's no need for you to upset yourself any more. I'll go over and explain you'll return the book. It's safe with you." Elsie watched as Tolly jumped up from her seat and was soon striding across the grass. She exchanged glances with the others as the good-looking man with Steve-O got to his feet as Tolly approached the table.
"That's Nelson Smith," said Dorothy, "known as Sonny. He's the old man's grandson. Undisputed Lothario of the cut."
Izzy said,
"I've seen him before. Seeing is fine. Look, but don't touch. Any girl who expects anything from Sonny Smith gets nothing but heartache for her trouble."
Elsie watched as Tolly smiled at Sonny, to which he responded, showing perfect white teeth. As he sat down again, Tolly knelt beside the bath chair and began talking to the old man. The resemblance between grandson and grandfather was remarkable. Their build and the shape of their faces was similar. Also, Steve-O's faded, thinning red hair was reminiscent of his grandson's vibrant curls. But where Sonny's movements were quick, Steve-O's were hesitant, probably due to illness or age, thought Elsie. A short conversation followed with a wave from the old man towards Izzy. Then Tolly was bounding back towards the table.
"I told him the book would be returned as soon as possible."
"What did the other one say?" Elsie asked.
"Sonny was very polite and hoped we were having a safe journey." "He scares me. He reminds me of Charlie," said Izzy with a sniff. "I thought he was very nice."
Elsie saw a dreamy look in Tolly's eyes. Dorothy glanced at Elsie, and an unspoken thought passed between them.
"Perhaps we've got to watch you where men are concerned, Tolly," Dorothy said. "We've an early start tomorrow, everyone. The sooner we arrive at Oxford, the more time we have to ourselves before continuing down the Thames."
And now Elsie was in bed. She was glad Izzy's secret was out in the open. She, Dorothy and Tolly would give Izzy courage to go forward with her new life. As for herself, Dorothy already knew about her marriage breakup, as did Izzy, and no doubt word would soon get to Tolly. Tolly wasn't as uncomplicated as Elsie had first thought. She spoke frequently of her work at the Currant Bun back in Titchfield, and how she wished, after the war, she could buy the place. Elsie had already thought if Tolly were to lose a little weight, she would be eye-catching. Her silky hair, clear skin and happy manner made her a delight to be with, and the girl could cook. Perhaps Tolly's unhappiness, which she couldn't quite hide, stemmed from never having had a proper boyfriend. Oh dear, she thought. She hoped Tolly hadn't set her sights on Sonny Smith. That would surely end in disaster. She didn't want to think any more about Tolly. Her body ached all over, and she was so tired she was almost too weary for sleep. Elsie yawned. Then she remembered Jack, and a tingle coursed through her body. She was determined not to feel guilty about being in his arms, even if the others teased her. She hadn't orchestrated it, though it had taken her just a single moment to recognize, from the look in his eyes, that he wanted her. Would she ever see him again? Chapter 15. Geoffrey stretched his legs in the marital bed and thought how good it felt to have space to move around, alone. Today, Sandra was bringing a few articles from the Crescent Road flat to make the house more homely. He shuddered, thinking of her many cat ornaments. Already the honeysuckle had disappeared from the conservatory.
"We need to let the light in, darling," she'd said.
He didn't like to antagonize her by saying that it felt baking hot in there now, and the last of the warm summer was yet to come. Sandra was still resident at the flat, though she was eager to join him in Weston Way. He was revelling in his freedom from her. To say he missed Elsie was an understatement. He realised now he'd taken her for granted, how she'd looked after him. Clean and ironed shirts had always hung in his wardrobe ready for him to put on. Fresh underwear and socks had been placed neatly in the drawers. When his suits had looked a little jaded, she'd taken them to the cleaners. He'd lost weight. Sandra was ecstatic about that, and thought the new clothes she'd bought him from her friend looked better on a slimmer man. He didn't care for the brightly patterned short-sleeved shirts she told him had to be worn hanging outside his trousers. She'd agreed he should continue wearing his tailored suits to work, because that was the standard attire his clients expected of a man in his position. Alas, no matter how hard he brushed them, they were beginning to look like cat blankets. End of CD 3.